Chapter 198. Scarlet. Makarov was startled and looked at Brando bitterly. He finally understood why Brando had asked that question. But this was a crucial moment and Fleetwood would not allow him to make this young man unhappy. Even if his members were to be alienated in front of him, he could only grit his teeth and swallow his anger. However, this punch came quickly and fiercely. Even with his mental fortitude, he couldn't help but turn his head away when faced with the disbelieving, questioning gaze of the young girl he had raised with his own hands. Even if he had 1,000 excuses to explain himself, even if he knew that this girl who he treated as his adopted daughter hoped that he could at least explain himself, he couldn't say a single word at this moment. Everyone present could feel the power of the heart of gold pulsating in her body. He did not know what happened to her that caused her power to rise so quickly. He thought that it was because of her potential in a life-and-death situation. This meant that she was at least a genius that they had neglected. But on the other side, the golden tree in Brando's hand was also emitting the power of the heart of gold. That was the origin of the golden bloodline. Eating it would give one the destiny of being chosen by the heavens. Makarov's explanation was stuck in his throat, but when he opened his mouth it became, "Scarlet, what are you?" His words seemed to drain all the strength of the young girl. She looked straight at the man who had so long occupied the place of a father in her heart, and there was not so much disappointment in her eyes as in a deep entreaty that she would believe even a single lie of happiness. She was as helpless as a foolish daughter, waiting for her heartless father to change his mind. She hoped that he would turn around and say, "Sorry, welcome back," but all she got was a tactful reply. It sounded like he was concerned, but it was as if he had distanced himself from her like a stranger. The tall figure in her memory seemed to have become distant and blurry. She clutched her chest with one hand and tears burst out of her eyes. "I'm sorry, why?" She whimpered like an injured animal. She lost the last bit of her strength and knelt on the ground. Her eyes closed and she fell forward with a loud bang. He lost consciousness. Seeing this scene, Makarov couldn't say a word. Brando looked at him coldly. He felt someone gently nudging him from behind. The young man nodded to show that he understood. If it wasn't for the dragon girl Arnaz, he wouldn't have been able to detect Scarlet's arrival. Perhaps he already knew what Makarov's answer would be, but even so, he wanted Scarlet to understand that the truth was not charity. However, he couldn't allow Makarov to continue playing chess with him. "I'm sorry." Brando sighed. He stood up, walked over to help Scarlet up and wiped the dirt off her face. The girl showed her weak side in her sleep. Her tear-stained face was a little pale, but she was as serene as an angel. The young man straightened her body and leaned her against an abies tree. Then he turned around and looked at everyone with a condescending gaze. "Mr. Brando?" Fleetwood interrupted when he saw Makarov's unstable emotions. "Makarov?" Brando interrupted. The anger in his chest was finally released, and his voice was as cold as a blade. Everyone was stunned. They didn't understand why Brando's attitude suddenly changed, but the young man shouted angrily, "Don't think that I don't know where you came from. Ever since Anson the 7th, Alwyn has been declining day by day. The light in the darkness seems to be floating up and down in the chaos. It is obscure and dim and the time seems to be fleeting. 10 years ago, you seized every opportunity to turn defeat into victory, throwing in all the chess pieces like gamblers. The entire plan was meticulous, ruthless, and seemed logical, but all of this was nothing more than a plot to overthrow Duke Erek, who had absolute power. You deceived the world, so that the world would not think that the muddle-headed old Duke Anthony was just trying to preserve everything in the end. Who else is helping you, Civic?" Brando's words were like sharp swords that pierced into everyone's hearts. Makarov and Fleetwood's faces turned pale. They even forgot to breathe at that moment. They only had time to guess who this young man was. The young man had already pointed out the outline of their plan. They believed that this was a sacred and all-or-nothing operation. All sacrifices were worth it. If necessary, they would even give up their lives. Political conflict had become a fanatical belief. Just like what Brando said, there was only one chance. As long as they seized it and waited for the moment to turn defeat into victory, the light of dawn would sweep away all the darkness. This legendary story had a legendary ending. However, they didn't think that this plan would fall into the eyes of an unfamiliar young man. They didn't even miss a single detail. This plan was first set 10 years ago, and some of the details were unknown even to the subsequent participants. Then this young man who used the name Brando. Who was he? What was he planning? The more Brando spoke, the angrier he got. He stood up straight like a sharp blade, his voice as cold as the winter. "You think you can represent the righteousness of the royal family, and your swords fight for the future of this country. Unfortunately, your stupidity doesn't allow you to see the truth. If you fail, can you still send others to their deaths? Wait, Fleetwood frowned slightly. He was a little annoyed. Although this young man held something very important to them, their plan couldn't be blasphemed because it represented the glory of the royal family. What are you trying to say, Grandmaster Fleetwood? Brando asked coldly. Everything you've said is based on a hypothesis. You want to know the truth? Brando sneered. He raised his head and couldn't help but take a deep breath. At this moment, it was as if another soul was standing beside him. The young man's eyes seemed to see through the shackles of the world. Sophie's words returned to the other side of his soul. Time and space collapsed in front of him. But after everything calmed down, he saw everything in the past. Palaces and cities burned in the flames. The kingdom was overturned. Everything he was familiar with was gone. The wish of Her Royal Highness. The vow of the Valkyrie. This kingdom seemed to be reborn from the flames. Every player put in all their effort to fight for it. But in the face of the invasion of Madara's undead and the black tide of players, they were all defeated. It was as if it was a destined failure and a tragic ending. However, these nobles were still here controlling the fate of this country. It was as if they could see the final outcome, the victory they believed in. Then, like a cold grim reaper, they clung to the lives in their hands and threw them into the frenzied sacrifice. The nameless lives flowed out like the cold blood in these people's bodies. They died. In exchange for a cold ending. But no one would take responsibility for it. The players remembered the dark humor, but what about these high and mighty nobles? They just changed the chessboard and continued their game. They were always sacred, representing light or darkness, justice or kindness. This belief was not to be blasphemed. Just like the blood of a noble family, it was unquestionable, on the surface. How do I tell you the truth? Brando sighed tiredly and waved his hand. Just like this golden apple in my hand. Of course, I know how it works for you because its appearance makes your game more brilliant. It's like a shining weight that tilts the scales in your favor. That's what you think. Unfortunately, it's not that I want to discourage you. No matter what, your failure is destined. He replied. What did you say? This time, even Buga couldn't help but frown. Young man, not everyone can become a seer. Fleetwood shook his head. But those witches who used rumors to bewitch people were all tied to the stake. Makarov added as he looked at Brando coldly. Brando smiled. Indeed, but he was the one who could foresee their failure. No, he was the one who saw it. But he wouldn't say that. He only asked, You don't believe me? Reason? Buga asked simply. I remember during Erwin's most glorious era. Erwin's knight held the swallowtail flag and bugle horns. When the bugle horn blew, the kingdom's blade charged forward. I remember that the battlefield was a sea of flags, embroidered with the golden coat of arms of Corvado, Grinoires and Erec. I remember that the nobles of that era still kept their oath. Brando smiled. Do you remember that oath? Everyone was stunned. You don't remember? Brando's eyes were full of disdain. It's fine, I can read it to you. Under this sword, I swear the sage's oath. I vow to lead my people away from strife and slaughter, away from the arrogance and greed of the nobles of the empire. I vow to not repeat the cold-blooded mistakes of history. I vow to make the nobles of this new kingdom follow the spirit of chivalry. I vow to be just and strict, honest and brave, kind and generous. I vow to keep it with all my strength. Brendel read out the words forcefully, then looked at the group of people who were speechless for a moment. Do you remember who made this oath? He asked softly. Fleetwood, Makarov and Buga looked at each other, their faces burning. Of course they knew. How could they not know? They had simply forgotten about it. Yes, Brando nodded. This is the origin of all your beliefs, the foundation of the nobles of Erwin. Your late king and the benevolent first king, King Eric, made this oath under the Lionheart. Do you remember what he said? If one day the nobles of Erwin forget their duty, then this sword will return to where it came from and will no longer protect this kingdom. Do you still remember? You don't remember, right? That's a pity. Brando sighed and looked at the forest. The afternoon sun shone through the forest. At this moment, the forest in the south looked so peaceful for the first time. P.S. I'll take note of the problems some students have with the plot and I'll speed it up. If you want to know what's to come, please log on to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 199. The young man's words lingered for a long time. No one dared to make a sound. His words pierced into the deepest parts of their hearts, and they couldn't help but lower their heads to think. Were their actions really as noble as they claimed? Even the strong-willed people like Fleetwood and Makarov couldn't help but waver for a moment. Yes, wasn't that glorious era the foundation of Erewhon's kingdom? But they quickly stabilized their confidence and calmed down. Although the late king's ideals were noble, the situation today is different, the scholarly old man sighed. In the end, we can't give up on what we should do just because of a possibility. Ideals cannot change reality. Makarov coldly replied. That's why you use the same arrogance and indifference to deal with another group of arrogant nobles. But in reality you are no different. Brando retorted with the same cold tone, be it the royal family or the nobles, none of you can truly change Erewhon. That's why you are destined to fail. You may have defeated your opponents, but can you defeat Madara? Cut the crap. Makarov's voice sounded like he was grinding his teeth. How can a divided kingdom resist an external enemy? Furthermore, this has nothing to do with you. Now, please fulfill your promise and give us the golden apple. Brando sneered and mentioned the golden apple. This is the fairy's apple, the most precious fruit from the golden tree. Legend has it that it can change a person's fate, but it's a pity. Brando looked at Scarlet with a sad expression. It can't change a country's fate. Maybe someone can change it, but that person is definitely not you. What you acknowledge will only be an obstacle to her. That's why. Brando put the fairy's apple back into his bag in front of everyone. You won't get it. Bastard. Makarov roared. His chest was filled with anger from being toyed with. Although he had expected this outcome, the contempt in Brando's attitude towards them really ignited his anger. This cunning fox, advisor of the royal faction, had lost his rationality and regained his identity as the former leader of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. A long sword appeared in his hand. Clang. A metallic sound rang out. Brando didn't retreat a single step. His expression didn't change, and he stared at Makarov's sword without blinking. However, between Cunning Fox's blade and the tip of the young man's nose, a hexagonal shield of light appeared. Layers of mysterious spells and runes flashed in the shield and then disappeared. String magic. And it was the most ancient kind. As a court wizard, Fleetwood's expression immediately turned ugly, as if he had seen a ghost. Ancient magic. The old man almost squeezed these words out of his throat. He looked at Brando with a changing expression, not knowing what to say for a moment. In this world, there was only one race that still used such ancient magic laws. The dragon race. Brando thanked Allah's in his heart, and then calmly admired Makarov's pale face. You are? Cunning Fox's throat moved. Brando was about to mock him, but at this moment he suddenly heard Allah's telepathic voice. Mr. Brando, what you said just now seemed to have resonated with something. This power, it's so strange. I can't suppress it anymore. What, that sentence? Brando was stunned. The part where we made the vow. No, I have to release the barrier. Allah said in a hurry. Hey, wait. Brando was about to ask her to hold on for a while so that he could be mentally prepared. Suddenly, he felt a tremor from the deepest part of his heart. It was not the prank of the dragon girl Allah's, nor was it the mysterious resonance between the planeswalker and the cards. It was more like a sense of recognition as a broad mind entered his thoughts. At that moment, it was as if the brightest light was produced in the darkness, and in this light, a door was opened. He seemed to have passed through the door, and saw the White Knight Ebden and the Earth Knight Gerald standing beside him. They nodded and smiled at him as if they were humans, and their eyes were full of encouragement and recognition. But the illusion only lasted for a brief moment before disappearing. Brendel finally regained his senses and found the source of the tremors. He subconsciously reached for the philosopher's slate in his pouch, but it was too late. He could feel the philosopher's slate buzzing in his hand as if it had a life of its own. The next moment, the clouds above the Chablis Hills parted. This afternoon. From the Northwind Forest to Lake Venerin, from the Golden Flame Castle to Rhoda in the Shire, and even from as far away as Bragg's, everyone who lived in this area witnessed this miracle. Above the blue sky, with a point in the south as the center, the platinum clouds parted layer by layer, like a stone thrown into a calm pool, and radiated outwards in all directions. After the last bit of cloud was cleared away, the blue sky was like a pure sapphire with a magnificent light purple color, and not a speck of dust could be seen. The townsfolk, the clerics, adventurers, and even the astrologers of the Council of Stars and Moon were alerted. Far away in the Sea of Death, the Wizard of Buga also recorded this phenomenon in Drala. The monks of the Lion's Heart Palace came out in full force. The recorder of the Black Tower was stunned and accidentally dropped his favorite crystal ball, and the pilgrims of the Thunder Gate could not help but kneel down and pray to the heavens. Everyone raised their heads and looked at the round vacuum-like sky in the south, but only a few people understood what was really happening there. The divine artifact's reaction. The light in the forest suddenly brightened up, and the darkness was swept away. Byuga, Makarov, and Fleetwood's expression changed drastically as they looked up at the sky. After the platinum-colored clouds dispersed layer by layer, what was left was the breathtakingly beautiful purple-blue sky. There were layers of magnificent and beautiful patterns that resembled gears, and each circle had a diameter of nearly 100,000 meters. That was the Tiamat, the law that Mother Marcia had set down to restrain the elements, worlds, and magic in the myths. It was also where the boundary of the elemental world was. No matter from which angle the mortals looked at this huge and intricate creation barrier, they would feel a sense of hopelessness from the bottom of their heart, and a sense of grandeur that came from the bottom of their heart. Brando held on tightly to the stone slab as if it was about to break free. He could not help but look up at the sky. The beautiful edge of Tiamat was sliding layer by layer against the background of the blue sky, and every time it slid, it would sweep across hundreds of kilometers of the sky. However, the curve that represented the law and the straight line were merging together again, and when the layers of the gears merged together and one of the centers was aimed at this area, the forest was silent for a moment. The wind stopped blowing. If this was in the game, Brando would have goosebumps when he saw this strange scene. This scene was very similar to the scene where the elemental lords or legendary wizards cast the highest level spells, the scene where level 14 spells were cast. These spells were forbidden spells in the usual sense or legendary spells. These spells were beyond the understanding of mortals. In fact, each of them directly mobilized the supreme law to destroy and eliminate in a destructive manner. In terms of destructive power, they were no weaker than the nuclear weapons of the original world. But at this moment he also felt goosebumps. The resonance in his heart finally reached its peak at this moment. There was a slight tremor in the center of the circular vacuum field in the sky, but when the tremor spread in all directions, a white beam of light descended from the sky. Far away in Dorora, one of the 12 leaders of the Byuga wizards, William Peaster held his magic quill in one hand. The tip of the quill stood motionless on the parchment filled with runes for a long time. Even the ink had soaked through the expensive lambskin, forming a small black dot on the parchment. Then the elder just stared out of the silver grating arch window. Between the sky and the sea, a silver beam of light stood straight. This is Eric's Lionheart sword. A beam of light pierced through the clouds. It zigzagged as it passed through the boundary of the elemental realm, and then fell vertically to the other side of Erewhon. These two beams of light reflected each other in the clear afternoon sky. At this moment, everyone lost the ability to speak. But Brando just wanted to die. He just occasionally pretended to be righteous, and he did not expect to get the approval of merciful Eric by accident. If he had known, he would not have read the damn oath. He had forgotten that he had accepted the quest from the White Knight Ebden. In a moment of excitement, he further inspired the quest. Of course, the inspiration quest was not strange, but what made him want to bang his head on the ground was that it triggered the divine artifact's reaction. Wait a minute, Lady Martha. Isn't the Lionheart sword a fantasy weapon? How did it trigger the divine artifact's reaction? When did it become a divine artifact? The forum said that this weapon was a gold-tier fantasy weapon, and judging from its history, it should be true. After all, it was impossible for a kingdom like Erewhon to keep a divine artifact. This thought flashed through Brando's mind. However, the strange phenomenon also flashed by. The beam of light lasted for about 3 to 5 seconds, and then gradually weakened. Brando pressed one hand on the sage slate and gradually stopped struggling. At the same time, he felt a mark in his heart, as if he could feel a direction. He knew that this meant that there was a connection between him and the Lionheart sword. A fantasy weapon had such an ability. Of course, there were advantages and disadvantages to this connection. The advantage was that he was one step closer to the legendary divine artifact. The disadvantage was that Brando looked at Fleetwood and Makarov, who were looking at him with unfathomable gazes. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 200. The atmosphere in the forest was a little awkward. As the chief court wizard, Fleetwood naturally understood what happened, but he did not know how to react. The reaction of the divine artifact, Martha above, stunned the scholarly old man. He had never thought of such a thing. But then again, if the other party was really a dragon even at such a young age, it was not something that the few of them would be able to stop. But the problem was that Makarov was still raising his sword and slashing at the opponent's magic shield. Of course it was not only them. In fact, Brando's mind was also in a mess. But after he sorted out his thoughts, he wanted to think of a way to scare these people away. In fact, after resonating with the divine artifact, Brando no longer had the mood to deal with these people. He knew that the real trouble did not lie with the group in front of him. With Allah's here, they would not be able to stop him for the time being. But the real problem was that such a huge magic reaction had been recorded by countless people. Anyone with a brain would know that something good had appeared in this area. He thought that in less than half a month, Randner would be in chaos. The narrow mountains and hills were filled with exploration parties from all over the world. There were even adepts that no one liked. Martha above, he did not even dare to imagine how chaotic this place would be. Brando had thought more than once about how he would affect the history of this world for the first time. But he did not expect it to come so quickly and so suddenly, giving him no time to prepare. That was why he was no longer worried about the Lionheart sword. Instead, he was more worried about whether his precious territory near Count Randner would be affected. Furthermore, would Her Highness' actions be affected as well? Could it be that the butterfly of history flapped its wings and changed the course of history? Of course, that was the worst-case scenario, but Brando could not help but sweat when he thought of it. But what was the saying? If you want to avoid trouble, trouble will come knocking on your door. Just as Brando was thinking about this problem, the forest suddenly resounded with clap, clap, clap. He immediately saw Fleetwood and Makarov. Fleetwood and Makarov were stunned for a moment before a trace of joy flashed across his face. They don't come with good intentions, Brando thought. He turned around just in time to see a middle-aged man wearing a thick purple velvet coat with a white shirt inside walking out of the forest. The newcomer clapped his hands and said with a smile, "So this is the Mr. Brando that the sly fox was talking about?" Sure enough, heroes come from the young. Normal people wouldn't have thought of this plan. Elemental activation. The corner of Brando's eyes twitched. He had already recognized who this guy was. He liked to wear a purple windbreaker with a white silk shirt inside, and had a smile that hid a dagger behind it. The Earl of the Violet Autonomous Region, Bali Braun. This guy was the most capable assistant of Duke Lone. Compared to Buga, he was just a small guard captain. He was the real big fish in Lantan Island. Almost 40 years later, he should be around level 80 by then. Brando had dealt with this person a lot in the game in the past. He knew that the other party looked hypocritical, but in fact he was a rare noble with a strong sense of justice. But later on, this person died in the battle with the tree herders, which was a great loss to Erwin. Brando looked at this person and could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth, but his tone was slightly gentler. Plan? Of course. Count Bar replied, "As far as I know, the Dragon Clan is a lone wolf in almost all situations, right? At most, they move with their mates, right? This guy knows us quite well." Brando immediately heard the voice of the dragon girl, Alaz. Brando snorted, thinking that this guy was harder to deal with than he thought. You haven't dealt with him before. But he still had the mood to bicker with Alaz, but he could not help but feel guilty. Dan Danian was different from Makarov, Buga, and even Fleetwood. He was a practical person, and he definitely wouldn't try to scare him. Since he was able to deal with him so confidently, he definitely had something up his sleeve. Moreover, even if there was only one more elemental awakened master, the situation would become a little more complicated. After all, Alaz was clearly a Lolita. Although she had the advantage of being a Lolita, against two half-activated elemental masters and a gold-tier Makarov, this Lolita dragon seemed to be unable to hold her own. He could not help but glance around the forest, and suddenly thought of another question. Danton is Duke Lone's most capable assistant, and he's a nobleman with real power. If he's here, Duke Anthony wouldn't have brought his army over, would he? Brendel looked carefully and saw shadows in the forest. Holy sh*t, he couldn't help but cry out in his heart. There were too many people. Openly mobilizing an army into another lord's territory, could it be that Duke Lone wanted to start a war with Count Randner? But wait. Brando immediately realized that something was wrong. Duke Lone did not just want to arrange for his only son to be brought back. Thinking of this, the young man's mind suddenly flashed like a bolt of lightning. He immediately thought of the small royal territory on the other side of Randner's border. Isn't that the private territory of the princess where the cavalry academy is located? Damn. The tree herders were fooled this time. Duke Anthony was going to build one path in the open, and another path in the dark. Because he was a newbie, Brando barely experienced Erwin's civil war, so although he knew the general process and the final result of the civil war, he did not know the specific process. Now it seemed that the princess had already gathered troops from all sides. No wonder she stabilized the front line from the beginning. He was wondering how the princess could hold on for so long with her original strength, until the situation changed later on. He glanced at the cunning fox in front of him, and knew who was behind this plan. Although this guy's face was a little repulsive, his personal ability was indeed first class. Brando could not help but break out in cold sweat. He thought to himself that he was lucky, or else he might have been played around by this old fox. He cursed in his heart and then whispered to Alaz, "Miss Alaz, why didn't you warn me just now?" He meant the army that appeared later on. The magic reaction just now was so strong that it attracted all their attention. Besides, it's just some insects, what's there to pay attention to? Oh, only the one in front of you is a little stronger. Insects? Brando thought to himself that it was an army. He did not know how many there were from here, but there were at least 1,000 people. And this was probably only a part of it. Barley had always been good at using a butcher's knife to kill chickens. He personally confessed that his biggest hobby, other than playing cards, was to fight with numbers and bully the weak. Of course, although this was just a joke, it was enough to show this person's character. Plus there are 2 super masters with semi-activated elemental power. Lolita, Miss Long, are you sure you're okay? Of course, but it's nothing. Alaz replied disdainfully. Brando did not believe it from the bottom of his heart. He thought to himself, do you think I've never seen a dragon? Although he was now an ordinary person, he had killed at least 80 dragons in the past, if not 100, so he was very clear about the other party's age and level. After thinking this through, Brando became careful. He waited to see what this Barley Danes had to say. What would Barley Danes say about this? So, the Violet Count continued, you're not actually a dragon, right? Brando thought to himself, how is that possible? Although he really wasn't of the dragon race, the ancient flux magic he had used before was the real deal. But his dragon magic. Makarov froze for a moment before asking. But this time, Fleetwood interrupted him and said, if I'm not wrong, that should be the effect of the scroll, right? Since Mr. Brando can get the golden apple and the divine artifact, then getting a draconic scroll should not be a problem. Brando heard this answer and could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth. He thought to himself, old Fleetwood, you're the chief wizard of the court. How can you be so old that you can't even differentiate between a draconic scroll and a draconic spell? However, he immediately remembered that Fleetwood wasn't at the age where his vision was blurry. In fact, Fleetwood hadn't even reached his peak yet. Logically speaking, he shouldn't have made such a low-level mistake. If this was not the case, then it could only be the other possibility. Brando immediately gritted his teeth and asked in his mind, Miss Alaz, the scroll you used? He immediately received a positive answer. Why? He asked. You see, that's why they dared to attack you, isn't it? Alaz smiled and said happily, I haven't beaten anyone up in a long time. Brando sighed. She was right. But the problem now was that they might not be able to beat her, miss. Thinking up to this point, he decided that this problem girl was unreliable. He took a deep breath and raised his head and said, maybe you're right, Barley Danes. Mr. Danes. However, you can try and see how many of these spells I have, can't you? Barley smiled and shook his head. No matter how many scrolls you have, do you have the confidence to fight against an entire army? Mr. Brando, this is not wise, so please hand over the golden apple. Brando really wanted to punch this guy in the face and smash that fake smile of his into smithereens. But just as he was about to think of a way to retaliate, another group of people suddenly appeared from the forest. In fact, it was the shrubbery in the east that made the sound. Then, in front of everyone's eyes, there were more than 20 fully armored elven warriors bathed in blood. Is that so? What if we join in? Nalathar took off his helmet and looked at Count Barley with an indifferent gaze. Gold rank, silver elves, Fleetwood and Makarov could only feel the corners of their eyes twitching. Barley? Dan was also stunned and almost choked on his words. How many years has it been since he last saw a silver elf? The Violet Earl stared at the 20 or so people and finally squeezed out a sentence. Silver elves, former allies. You're the only race that didn't participate in the Civil War. Are you going to start a war with the humans because of this person? Nalathar nodded and looked at Brando. I owe him a promise. Fine, Barley sighed. But even so, you want to fight against Duke Lone's army with just 20 elves? I admit that you're the strongest warriors, but my men. But he couldn't finish his sentence. In fact, it wasn't just him. It was as if everyone was suddenly silenced. Everyone, including Brando, saw a dazzling silver light appear in the forest, and the unicorns that the elven knight rode, the Him Legion. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. Come to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 201. Your Highness, there are too many enemies. Please take shelter for a moment. Sir Benninger's earnest pleas came from outside. His voice was urgent, and the situation was not optimistic. Steel bolts hit the iron plates in the compartment of the carriage's side wall. Assassins were coming from all sides of the forest. Even Princess Griffin herself did not expect that in Graf's own territory, she would usher in the most dangerous assassination since she had fled. However, the young girl pursed her lips and looked straight ahead with her pale silver eyes. She replied, "No need. I will wait here for my knights to arrive." Your Highness, Sir Benninger. Yes. It's nothing. Thank you. The girl said calmly. The voices outside the carriage stopped. The young man turned around and put his hand on the hilt of his sword. All that was left was the courage in his heart. As usual, the half-elf girl was wearing her favorite silver-white princess dress. Her hands were folded on her knees, and even at this moment, the girl's sitting posture was even more upright than the most meticulous young lady. The princess of Erewhon's royal family exuded the majesty of an ancient family. Even in the eyes of the strictest nobles, she was the brightest pearl on Erewhon's crown. In the eyes of the princess, the only heir to the throne of Erewhon was looking at her timidly from the opposite side of the carriage. Sister. Haruz, the only son of King Oberg VII, whispered in fear. The girl glared at her only brother coldly. Haruz, take your sword and turn it around. Haruz had always been obedient to his strict sister, and this time he did not dare to disobey. He overcame his fear and carefully turned the sword around. There was a line of small words engraved on the scabbard. Call my name Courage. This was the motto of the royal family of Covardo, and it was also the motto of the half-fairy princess. But when it came to the only son of King Oberg VII, it became a glaring irony. The little boy grabbed his sword with both hands and looked up at his sister helplessly. The latter's sternness and the danger lurking outside the carriage made him at a loss for what to do. Tears welled up in his eyes. Seeing her brother like this, even Griffin couldn't help but sigh. Her heart softened and she said softly, "It's okay. I'm here. I'll protect you." The little boy wiped his tears with his sleeve and nodded vigorously. The carriage became quiet. The battle outside also seemed to have quieted down. In Graf's Royal Cavalry Academy, everyone on the field, in the classrooms, and in the corridors could not help but stand up and look at the strange scene outside the arched window. Freya looked up in a daze. All she could see was the silver beam that pierced through the clouds. Under the vast sky, behind the mountains, the light that connected the sky and the earth was like the Babel Tower in ancient myths. With the light as the center, the clouds slowly moved to the sky thousands of miles away, as if they were forming radiating fish-scale patterns in a wider angle. The magnificence of the scene was beyond all words in the mortal world. It could penetrate one's soul and make one tremble from the depths of one's heart. What was that? The girl was wearing the training equipment. She had one hand on her ponytail, and she was so stunned that she forgot to put it down. Her face reflected the light of the clouds as she stared in that direction. What was Lady Martha trying to tell the world? More and more people came to the training grounds of the Royal Cavalry Academy. The crowd screamed and passed information to each other as if the end of the world was coming. Everyone looked up at the sky in the south and held their breaths. The whispers of the crowd became louder and louder. The instructors who came out to maintain order quickly joined in the crowd. They shook their heads in disbelief, unable to believe what they were seeing. This is a resonance reaction, right? What did you say? He saw the girl who had one hand behind her head pressing down on her ponytail turn her head and stare at him with a questioning look on her face with her bright light brown eyes. Count Beckberg's second son's heart skipped a beat. This was a rare opportunity. The majority of the students in the Royal Cavalry Academy were male students. The few female students in each batch naturally became the target of these nobles. Freya, who had an outstanding appearance and temperament, was even rarer because she did not have any family background. She was called a delicious prey. This hunting game was spread among the senior students, so the prey naturally did not have any awareness. However, Freya instinctively felt that there were more and more strange people around her. This made this girl from Butchie instinctively feel nervous and uneasy. However, she could not help but take a second look at the blonde boy who answered her question. You seem to know something. It's a type of magic reaction, but it's so strong. I've never heard of it before. The second son of Count Beckberg immediately showed his best side and replied with a smile. Magic reaction? Freya's heart skipped a beat. She inexplicably thought of a certain night in the Golden Tree Canyon. She did not know how that fellow was doing. However, she immediately turned around to prevent her burning expression from falling into the eyes of others. The girl from Bucci raised her head and stared at the silver pillar of light. The light was gradually fading. She took a deep breath and tried to calm the panic in her heart as she asked, "Where is that place? If it's that direction, it should be towards Randner." Randner. Freya could not help but place a hand on her chest. She could feel her heart beating vigorously. "Brando, is that you? I miss you so much." The girl's restlessness and shyness were seen by the youth as a sign that his attack was effective. What an inexperienced country girl. He could not help but think in his heart. However, he maintained a gentle smile on his face and wanted to say something else. But it was at this moment that a hurried bell rang throughout the playground, interrupting the young people's sweet talk. Everyone on the playground had to reluctantly withdraw their gazes from the strange phenomenon in the southern sky and look in another direction on the playground. The silver bell of Basta Academy was hung on the top of the bell tower of the administration hall. It was only rung during celebrations or the most urgent situations. Thus, everyone could not help but think, what happened? Is it related to the strange phenomenon from before? But a group of cavalrymen had already entered the field from the other side. As soon as they entered, they separated the people on the field. The leader of the group was a girl wearing a purple swallow-tailed military uniform. She rode her horse in front of everyone, then turned her horse around and stopped. She raised her chin slightly and looked at everyone. "Everyone from each grade, from the moment you hear this order, go to your positions. I'll give you 3 minutes to prepare for battle." The girl's voice was low and slightly hoarse, but it was like a cold wind that swept through everyone's heart, causing everyone to feel suffocated. Prepare for battle? What battle? A mock battle? But it's not the time to test it yet. Someone from the preparatory grade? What? Freya looked at the female knight with black hair that reached her waist. She stood upright on her horse like a javelin and could not help but be stunned for a moment. She heard the young man mumbling subconsciously behind her, so she turned around and asked the second son of Count Beckberg. "That woman is a student from the preparatory grade." The preparatory grade is actually equivalent to the Black Cavalry or the Imperial Guard. So, although they are called students, they are actually soldiers. That woman is called Maynard. She is the daughter of Madame Miller. Or let me put it another way, it might be easier for you to understand. Madame Miller is the sister of Duke Lone. She married a knight a few years ago. Her husband died in the 10 Years' War and has been living at home ever since. This is her only daughter. The second son of Count Beckberg replied with a serious face, "That woman is a genius of the Basta Academy. But then again, those who can enter the preparatory grade naturally can't be compared to the useless trash like us." Maynard. Freya remembered this name. At the same time, she looked at the youth and smiled at him with some gratitude. "Don't say that. I think you're very powerful. You know so much." The second son of Count Beckberg was stunned. He saw the serious and sincere look in the girl's eyes and could not help but be slightly moved. But this feeling was only for a moment. The youth sneered in his heart and thought, "Wait till you have a taste of me, then you will know how powerful I am." Hee hee. The silver elven knight stood silently in the forest, facing off against Duke Lone's private army on the other side. There was no wind in the forest. The black and silver swallow-tailed flags drooped dejectedly in their respective camps. After the clouds in the sky dispersed, the afternoon sun shone down on the forest without any reservation. It formed a solid light pillar at the edge of the treetops. These light pillars fell on the lily insignia on the flags and the bear and wolf insignia on the flags. Other than the occasional sneeze or the neighing of the war horses, there was no other sound in the forest. It was an awkward silence. Macaro, Fleetwood, Buga, Count Bar, Nelamines, and the silver elf knight commander who was wearing a long pointed helmet. None of them said a word. Only Brando sat calmly in the middle. He knew that Alaz was right beside him, so he was not too worried about any trouble. With Nalathar and this immature Lolita, the Violet Count shouldn't be able to think of any way to cause trouble for him. He stared at the rows of elven knights that seemed to be cloaked in silver light, guessing their intentions amidst the strange silence. The silver elves abided by an ancient prophecy and had not returned to the continent for centuries. Why would they appear this time? Even if it meant breaking their oath. P.S. Everyone's support will be engraved in my heart. This chapter is a gift to this friend. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 202. The strategy guide did not mention anything about this part of the story, probably because they ended it too early. Who would have thought that the Silver Elves had already appeared on the continent before the First War of the Black Rose? While he was thinking about this, he went to rummage through the corpse of the Acolyte of Earth out of boredom. The residual magic in the corpse was condensing into a crystal of high purity. This was a drop from a level 65 boss, and it also had the attribute of the blood of God. It was one of the best forging and alchemy materials of the same level, second only to the treasures of the dragon. He could not help but look at Alaz beside him. Of course he could only see air. "You have a weird look in your eyes, Mr. Brando?" "Is that so? But Alaz already has a mate and I'm not interested in humans. But if it's Mr. Brando, I don't mind giving it a try once in a while." Cough cough. Brando choked and coughed. Both sides looked at him. Count Bar turned around and looked at the Silver Elves with cold eyes. He broke the silence first. "Let's negotiate." The Silver Elves nodded. In fact, the long and boring negotiation lasted until the evening. The only real participants were Bar, Fleetwood, and the Silver Elf Knight Commander. On the other side, Makarov and Buga, under Brando's instructions, helped eke out from the bushes covered in blood and reluctantly thanked him. The Silver Elves had made it clear that they wanted to protect Brando because he protected their king's tomb, so they had no choice but to lower their stance. In fact, Brando gained more than that. He felt that he had won the highest level of respect from the Silver Elves. Not only were the warriors friendly to him, the Silver Elf commander even gave him a piece of ginkgo leaf in private. Of course, Brando did not think that it was a token of love. Although it looked like a bookmark, he knew that it was not as simple as a bookmark. In fact, it was a token of friendship. In other words, if he were to be harassed in Erewhon in the future, he could take this ginkgo leaf and seek political asylum. Of course, this was just a joke. This ginkgo leaf represented that the Silver Elves owed him a favor. As long as he or his descendants carried this ginkgo leaf, they would be able to obtain a chance to ask for help from the Silver Elves. Brando did not know what the request for help was. He only knew that in his previous life, someone had used this item to rent more than 100 heavy elven infantry from the Silver Elves. The term of the loan was 100 years. Although they were not as rare as the Phoenix Guards, they were still one of the best troops on the continent. However, even though Brando was itching to give it a try, his rationality told him that it was unwise to be impatient. After all, this was the real world and not a game. Building a good relationship with the Silver Elves would be beneficial in the future. If he were to appear impatient from the start, wouldn't this noble and cold race look down on him? Wouldn't that be a loss? Even though the Violet Earl looked at the scene with a solemn expression, he knew that he could not allow his subordinates to fight the Silver Elves here. The reputation of the Sacred Hymn Legion was once known throughout the continent. Even after 7 centuries, no one dared to challenge them. After comparing the strengths of both sides, the Violet Earl made a wise choice. After both sides left the neutral zone, they returned to their respective camps and ordered their troops to turn around and retreat 300 meters. Only then did the atmosphere in the forest calm down. Brendel sat beside the Acolyte of Earth's corpse and looked at the scene with surprise. Even though he did not participate in the negotiations, he knew that the core of the negotiations was about why the Silver Elves had reappeared after hundreds of years of disappearance. Even though this area used to be part of the Elven Empire, it was given up by the Elven Empire. Thus, the Erewhon Empire had the right to declare their sovereignty. Today, after 200 or 300 years, this area had become part of the Elven Empire's territory. Even the closest allies of the Elven Empire could not casually step into this area. However, Brando could see that the Silver Elves were extremely stubborn. He did not know what kind of agreement was reached between the two sides that made Bali and Fleetwood accept it. "Why do you think the Silver Elves returned to the continent?" he suddenly asked. The dragon girl Allah's nonchalant voice rang out. "How would I know about those weird fellows? They don't interact with outsiders. Ayaya, don't disturb other people's business." Allah's voice suddenly complained. "Business?" "Of course," Allah's voice sounded proud. "I'm writing a script about the Knight Brando. It took me a while to get the idea. Oh right, I forgot to mention to Mr. Brando that my profession is a poet." "Poet?" Brendel's brows furrowed as he listened. It seemed that the profession of a poet was extremely popular among the dragon race. He remembered a very famous plot in the game. There was a giant dragon that created a huge underground city, and then captured a few powerful monsters and placed them in there, turning them into bosses and other monsters. Then it let the players who did not know enter the challenge. It recorded the results of the challenge and then wrote a story. Of course, those who actually defeated the boss would be able to obtain a treasure. This treasure was actually a very small part of the dragon's collection. In fact, it was later proven that it was not even 1/10 of the profits it obtained from each story. He remembered that the dungeon was a level 45 dungeon. At first, the players thought that it was just a normal dungeon. But later on, the inside story was discovered and it became a popular story. But the dragon race's bad taste was also evident. Of course, in comparison, this giant dragon at least got rich through labor. Compared to some unscrupulous robbers, it was much better. Of course. The dragon girl seemed to be proud, but suddenly her tone changed. Don't bother me, it's so annoying. Forget it, I'll go write it myself. After she finished speaking, Brando heard the voice beside him go silent. Tisk, he could not help but sneer. But at this time he suddenly heard a click behind him. The young man thought that Alaz had returned so quickly. But when he turned around he saw Nalathar standing there. At this moment, the former commander of the Phoenix Guards had taken off his helmet. He looked at Brando seriously, and then at the corpse of the giant beast beside the young man. A trace of doubt flashed in his silver eyes. Brando was stunned. But then he smiled and suddenly said, I think Nalathar. Nalathar looked at him and was slightly startled. It's better if you wear the helmet. What? The silver elf asked indifferently. You're too handsome, I'm a bit stressed. The young man sighed. For the first time, Nalathar could not help but smile. He thought about it seriously and really did put the helmet back on. Only a pair of silver eyes were left on Brando. But Nalathar paused for a moment and said, I'm leaving, Brando. Brando was slightly startled. He had never thought about this before. But wasn't this inevitable? The mission was over and Nalathar should of course return. He suddenly wanted to say something but the words were stuck in his throat. The scenes of fighting side by side with Nalathar for the past few days replayed in his mind. Although there were no unnecessary words, but the sense of trust that came from the bottom of his heart grew. He looked at Nalathar and lowered his head. Where would Nalathar go after he returned? The Silver Elf King's tomb or the altar? The power of Shay's altar was weakening by the day. Although he said that he would return one day to bring Nalathar news to the outside world, who knew if they would ever meet again? Perhaps it would be like a real storyline mission and he would only meet Nalathar once. When he returned, there would only be a lonely altar left in the forest of Chablis. Brando knew that this was very likely. He wanted to say something but his heart suddenly felt empty. It was so empty that he could not say anything. The young man hesitated for a long time and said heartlessly, You're leaving, Nalathar? But you haven't done what you promised me. Don't tell me you don't want to go back on your word, the Silver Elf commander snickered. Going back on my word? You humans invented a good word. Of course I'll do it. As he spoke, he took out a scroll and handed it to Brando. Nalathar hesitated for a moment and replied softly. My thoughts are written on it, my friend. Those words struck Brando like a bolt of lightning, and he stood there without moving for a long time. Nalathar smiled and handed the scroll back to Brando, then leaned forward and hugged him. Thank you for bringing us to a battle that I haven't seen for a long time. My blood is boiling again. You're very good and the battle was exciting, but all good things must come to an end. Also, you owe me a promise, the Silver Elf commander whispered. Remember to tell me what happened outside decades, 100 years. Don't go back on your word. My friend, is that how you say it? He struggled to pronounce the word, go back on your word, in Kurlutz, then asked with a smile. Yes, Brando raised his hand and rubbed his eyes. The wind is a little strong. Nalathar nodded in understanding, and his body slowly disappeared into the air. Only his final smile was left, but it was also fading away. The heroic spirits of the 20 elven warriors turned into white light and soared into the sky, disappearing into a distant place in the southern forest. Everyone saw this scene, but only the Silver Elves, Alaz and Brando knew what really happened. The young man saw the Silver Elf Knight commander nodding kindly at him from afar, as if he was comforting him. Brando felt a little relieved and felt a little better. Indeed, Nalathar was right. All good things must come to an end. Isn't that right? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 203. Brando finally calmed himself down, but when he raised his head again, he was surprised to see Count Barr standing in front of him. What is this guy trying to do? You're Mr. Brendel, right? The Violet Count's smile disappeared as he asked seriously. What's wrong? Brando asked in a bad mood. Even though we have different opinions, we seem to be on the same side. At least I can be sure that you are not on our side, right? Before Brando could reply, the Violet Count continued, "Of course, we all have our own way of reviving the kingdom, but there is no need to hate each other. I admit that Mr. Makarov's way of doing things is a little extreme, but he is only a mortal." "What are you trying to say? Are you willing to join our side? Rather than complaining, why don't you do it yourself? I hope to see an excellent young man like you on our side." Bar seemed to have forgotten his previous unhappiness and sincerely invited Brendel. "This is in line with your usual style," Brando thought. But he shook his head. "Nonsense. If it weren't for the fact that we're on the same side, you wouldn't even have the chance to stand here and talk." Brando knew that with Allah's help and Scarlet's ginkgo leaf, it was only a matter of minutes for him to keep this army here. But he didn't want to be too harsh on them. He had already taught Makarov and Fleetwood a lesson with Scarlet and Sanford, but if he took another step forward, there would be a conflict between the two sides. Brando wasn't a reckless young man who couldn't see the situation clearly. He knew that if he kept Duke Lone's army here, the princess's side would be invaded by Erek's army. If things went wrong, even Freya would be in danger, not to mention the future. Since Bar was wise enough not to continue the topic of the golden apple, Brendel didn't want to talk about it anymore. What a joke. "No," Brendel shook his head and replied coldly, "you will see me very soon. Trust me, but not here and not in your one-sided way." He rejected him firmly, but his next words made Bali pause for a moment. "You will see me very soon. Trust me, but not here and not in your one-sided way." The Violet Count listened to Brendel's words with a complicated expression, and then he looked at Brendel deeply. "I'll wait and see," he answered thus. The real battle was led by the senior knight students under the leadership of the reserve officers. When the junior freshmen like Freya arrived, they were only responsible for cleaning up the battlefield. Like the others, when she arrived at the battlefield, she saw the hedgehog-like carriage in the middle of the forest from afar. A row of knights in silver armor surrounded the carriage. There were many corpses of their companions around the knights, but even so, they did not allow anyone to get close to the carriage. They insisted on treating the wounds of the dead and their companions. As a result, the battlefield was clearly divided into two colors, silver and purple. Neither interfered with each other. There were corpses everywhere on the road and in the forest. Occasionally, there would be mournful wails from far and near, or the screams of nobles' daughters and sons. In fact, when the senior students passed by the battlefield, they did not kill everyone. Some of them even deliberately left a lot of seriously injured people behind. But except for the necessary survivors, the rest of the people had to become cold corpses. This job was left to the freshmen who cleaned up the battlefield. Many of them were too scared to do it. Some even felt disgusted. Young people like Freya, who was promoted from the guards and the militia, were much better. She just guessed the identity of the person in the carriage and then buried her head in her own work. Count Beckberg's second son followed behind him with a pale face. He had vomited all the things he wanted to vomit. Now the young man could only retch. He held onto a fir tree as he looked at Freya's clean and efficient actions with admiration. She really is a girl with character. "Do you know who that is?" He gasped for breath and asked. "What?" Freya didn't understand and turned around to ask. "The carriage." The girl from the countryside of Bucci looked at the carriage in confusion. Her bright eyes showed her confusion as she shook her head. "The emblem on the carriage is a sacred beetle. It only belongs to one person in the kingdom." "Huh?" The young man looked at Freya in surprise. How did she come to the Royal Academy if she didn't even know this? However, he soon realized that she was not pretending to be so innocent. He shook his head and replied, "Grandmaster Fleetwood, the chief court magus of Erewhon." The girl was shocked. Count Beckberg's second son shook his head again. "But if Grandmaster Fleetwood is in the carriage, we don't even need to do anything. Therefore, the person in the carriage could be someone else. However, there aren't many people close to Grandmaster Fleetwood. Other than the king, only his students can borrow his carriage." "Your Highness?" Freya couldn't help but stare with wide eyes. Although she was just a country girl, she still understood this common knowledge. The young man nodded. However, as the two were talking, a black warhorse suddenly swept past them. The knight on the horse quickly passed through the forest, but seemed to be stunned for a moment. He turned his horse around and came to a stop in front of them. Freya was slightly startled. She subconsciously raised her head with the young man beside her and saw a beautiful but cold face. The head on the snow-white neck was like an exquisite work of art. Even in the north of Corvado, it was difficult to see such a perfect face. The sharp chin had an arc as if it had just walked out of a painting. It made people think that the so-called beauties of the north that were praised in the bard's poems might have been born from this. The girl's eyes were like a pair of cold amethysts. The people of the north more or less had the blood of the Myernas, but it was rare to see such pure blood. Her lips were tightly pursed, and her thin eyebrows under her bangs were slightly raised. Then she frowned with dissatisfaction, giving people a feeling that she didn't like to smile. Her straight and slender nose seemed to represent the girl's extremely strong character. But at this moment she only let out a soft snort. She looked down at the two people, her eyes slowly sweeping over Freya and falling on the second son of Count Beckberg. "You're Freya?" She stared at the second son of Count Beckberg, making the latter feel as if he was a poisonous snake in the grass that was locked on by the sharp eyes of a falcon. But when Maynard spoke, his low, cold and slightly hoarse voice was asking Freya. "Why yes. Your results in horsemanship and swordsmanship training are very good," Maynard said with a low and magnetic voice. "I've heard about you, but if you want to achieve your wish, it's best to stay away from these scum." The girl rode on her horse and looked back at the young man with a disdainful gaze, speaking bluntly. Both of them were stunned. The second son of Count Beckberg frowned and subconsciously retorted, "Senior Maynard, if you say that," but before he could finish his words, he heard a soft clang, and then he felt a slight chill on his neck. Just as the corner of his eyes saw the cold reflection on the snow-white blade, the young man realized that Maynard had already dismounted from her horse, unsheathed her long sword and placed it on his neck. The whole action was done in one breath, and even his hands froze when he made a gesture of spreading out his hands. "Did I allow you to interrupt?" Maynard asked coldly. The young man's back was drenched in cold sweat, and he couldn't say a word for a moment. "What's your name?" the girl asked again. "Sang Sengani, soldier rank." "And I Maynard I." The girl's sword came closer and interrupted him, reporting to Sir. The second son of Count Beckberg swallowed his saliva and replied in a trembling voice, "Sir, I'm a second-year student. I haven't reached the rank of sergeant yet." He almost didn't dare to say another word, and used all his strength to force the words out of his mouth. Maynard sheathed her sword with a clang, so fast that almost no one saw it clearly. She turned around and looked coldly at the young man who was touching his neck and cursing loudly in his heart. Her purple eyes were filled with undisguised disdain, but when she opened her mouth, it was an unquestionable order. "Then, soldier, I order you to shut up." Then she turned around and adjusted Freya's collar, which was a little crooked from cleaning up the battlefield, and then she patted her shoulder and said softly, "Remember what I said, it won't hurt you." Freya didn't move, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. "Should I say thank you? But if she's really so powerful, will I become someone like her? One day." She couldn't help but think so. "Who is that?" When the half-fairy princess turned around, she whispered to the young man beside her. Her gaze passed through the window of the carriage and fell on the side of the forest. The whole process of the conflict between the second son of Count Beckberg and Maynard fell into this girl's eyes. She pulled open the curtain with one hand and looked at the two girls in the forest in a daze, feeling a trace of familiarity in her heart. Madame Miller's daughter, or rather she's related to Duke Lone. Her talent is not bad, and she's also a die-hard supporter of the royal family, so she should be trustworthy. Sir Benninger only took a glance and replied. Hearing the young man's silly look, the girl couldn't help but smile. "Of course I know Maynard, she's my close friend." "Benninger, are you too tired?" "I'm sorry." Benninger replied awkwardly. "I'm talking about the other one, do you know her?" The half-fairy princess asked again. "I think she's a little familiar. That's Everton's daughter?" A gentle voice came from outside the carriage. Griffin was slightly startled, and then a trace of surprise flashed in her pale silver eyes. She turned around and asked in a low voice, "Lord Oberway?" There was a moment of silence outside the carriage. Then there was a low laugh. "That's me, Your Highness. It seems that I'm a little late." To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 204. Living in the vast highlands to the north of Oween, the Gurch tribe had a well-known legend. Legend had it that the lone soldier on the battlefield was the one favored by the god of death. Nostar had also heard of this legend before. He was a knight recruited from the Balta region in the north of the kingdom. He came from a noble family and had some skills in taming beasts before he joined the army. After joining the army, he naturally became a Wyvern Knight and was part of the 34th Regiment's Wyvern Cavalry Squadron. This army was originally part of the kingdom's southern army, but the latter had long been scattered by Madara's undead army in this war. Even their commander, Count Bainag, had died. Nasida's unit waited for a long time, but there were no signs of a ceasefire. Instead, the undead of Madara were getting stronger by the day, and the nobles behind them used the excuse that the negotiations had come to an end and the war had ended as an excuse to not provide them with any support. The messengers sent to contact the White Mane Army and Erek were nowhere to be found, and the situation was getting worse by the day. Baron Kellen, the supreme commander of the 34th Regiment at the southern border of Randner, wrote in his diary, "The situation in the south is getting worse by the day. We don't know where our brothers are scattered, and the undead of Madara are attacking from all directions. We can't contact anyone and the news seems to have been cut off. Even retreating has become impossible. The nobles are doing what they want, and today this territory is out of the control of the kingdom. Martha above, may I live to see the end of this nightmare, but to Vayne?" None of this was important to Nosida. He and his wyvern were shot down while patrolling a human village that was destroyed by the undead, and became the legendary person of the Gurch tribe who was targeted by the Grim Reaper's cold gaze. He raised his head with a face full of blood, and saw in despair rows and rows of skeleton warriors coming from all directions from the ruins of the village. He was pinned down by the wyvern's corpse, and the light crossbow in his hand was the only weapon he had to protect himself. He raised his arm and shot an arrow at one of the skeletons. The crossbow that had been blessed by the holy water exploded with a dazzling light, and a skeleton turned into ashes in the white light. But after a series of white lights, even more undead creatures drowned out Nozidar's vision. An endless feeling of dejection shrouded the young man. That was a few months ago, Nozidar could not help but think. When they heard that Madara had split into 3 groups to invade the kingdom, be it the soldiers or the nobles, almost everyone held a relaxed attitude as they waited to see how these backward and barbaric Dark Lords would fall apart due to infighting and disagreements in command, just like every other joint invasion in history. But the final result was out of everyone's expectations. Madara's army was decisive, calm and effective. In comparison, the kingdom of Erwin was more like an old man past his prime, unable to withstand the attacks and showing signs of fatigue. The kingdom's former glory was long gone. 3 centuries ago, the 17th Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, called the Blade of Flames, the model of ancient glory, only existed in the history of the past. After shooting the last arrow, the young man calmly threw away the crossbow, and tightly held the necklace with his wife's name on it with one hand. He looked up, and a tall skeleton had blocked the sun above his head. The fiery red soul fire in his eyes danced. "Farewell, father, mother, and dear Vanessa. I only hope that you can remember your son and husband and many others who fought in this place to protect Erwin. But there is no hope for this kingdom." After October, the smell of autumn gradually became stronger, and the plains along the coast of Tanajul were dyed with a layer of pale yellow. Just by riding on the road between the countryside, Brando and the rest could already feel the obvious smell of war. After the leather armor was torn apart by Alaz, Brando simply found a tailor in a town along the way and ordered a set of long black windbreaker and breeches, putting on the airs of a lord. He sat up straight on the horse and looked around, wearing a pair of eye-catching white gloves and a silver-plated long sword at his waist, looking somewhat like a young noble. But this was not because he wanted to indulge in the feeling of being a noble, but because it was easier to avoid trouble. After leaving the hills of Chablis, the month of travel became more and more boring. Although the law and order had collapsed, the bandits around the town were mostly farmers who could not make a living. On the other hand, Brando's group of 20 people was well equipped, like the children of a noble. These people who were forced into desperation due to poverty would not easily provoke them. But Brando could not help but sigh when he saw the empty farms along the way. In fact, on the day of Chablis, the dragon girl Alaz had warned him that an undead army from Madara was currently entrenched in the south of Tanajul. This news coincided with the history Brando knew. In history, Black Knight, Insursta did not leave Tanajul even after half a year of the armistice because he was hungry for more. Furthermore, the ancient kingdom did not have the time to care about other things at this moment. It was close to the end of the month of autumn, October, and in the other history Brando knew, the upper echelons of the ancient kingdom were beginning to stir. According to what he knew, the support behind Oberg's eldest son Hamel came from Queen Anna's forces. Anna was the sister of Duke Cypher, and her ascension to the throne represented the beginning of the restoration of the Cypher dynasty. The royal faction members who supported House Corvado had different views on this matter. Furthermore, she had an ambiguous relationship with Marquis Kluge, and they even worked together to imprison the king. In history, at the beginning of the 11th month, Hamel suddenly announced his coronation, and this event officially opened the curtains of the internal division of the royal faction. Princess Griffine, who had a strong personality, naturally would not silently accept it. She immediately announced to all the nobles and knights in her own territory that Hamel's throne was not legitimate. Those who supported her were naturally the core members of the royal faction who were already dissatisfied with the queen and the elven faction that she represented. At the end of the 11th month, Duke Erek announced his support for Hamel. At the same time, the various regions started to become independent or sided with one another, and Erwin's civil war began. From then on, until 2 years later, this civil war completely shook the foundation of the kingdom. Although the kingdom experienced a short period of prosperity after that, the kingdom had lost its new blood and was unable to be reborn from the fire. It could be said that Erwin's destruction accelerated from this moment onwards. At this critical juncture, no one cared about what Black Knight in Cersta was doing in the south. However, that didn't mean that the impact didn't exist. The entire village in this area had migrated, leaving behind a desolate area. When they passed through the empty and silent villages, they could feel a clear sense of desolation. But as they headed south, this sense of desolation gradually changed. As they were nearing the heart of Tonajel, Abes, the road finally started to become more lively. The ruler of Tonajel was Count Randner's third son, Baron Grodin. Brando was not unfamiliar with this name, but he was not familiar with it either. In this era, most nobles were cold and opinionated, but the ruler was different. Apart from sharing a noble's face, he was also harsh, cruel, and exploited his subjects even more. Brando and the rest had already noticed this when they entered Abes. Or rather, they did not have much hope before this, but their expectations were lowered by a lot. The first thing that caught their eyes were the citizens living outside of Ferber. Only the truly poor and lowly would live outside the city without any protection. Generally speaking, they were either farmers working outside the city or refugees fleeing for their lives. On both sides of the street, there were only crumbling and dirty thatched huts. Men and women were scantily clad, and their faces were sallow and emaciated. Their eyes were dim and there was no hope for the future. Dust was everywhere on the street, and the dry air was filled with the smell of animal dung. Compared to this place, even the dogmatic, slow, and self-righteous nobles and bureaucrats in Brugloss seemed cute. At least in those places, although the status of the citizens was low, at least they could still survive. However, just like the naturally mean people born from barren land, the more barren the land, the more they demanded. Brando knew that the reason for this difference was not because the nobles of Grimoires were more humane, but because the land in Tonajel was more barren, and the people naturally could not tolerate it. Amandina, who was once a noble's daughter, could not help but cover her mouth in disbelief. "My lord, the territory you want to inherit is in this place?" She could not help but ask with a little disappointment. She originally thought that after leaving the Highlander Dominion, the eastern coast of Tonajel would be a prosperous place. Being close to the sea meant that trade was flourishing, and flourishing trade meant wealth. Even if it was not as good as Ampere Seal, it should be comparable to Bragg's, right? She did not expect that it would be such a bleak scene. Brando was also stunned. Because he did not tell Amandina that the mercenaries of Lopez were actually his summoned creatures, he caused her to be sad for nothing and blamed himself for it. Naturally, he would be punished for it. For at least a month after Chablis, Amandina spoke to him in a businesslike manner. She no longer treated him with a friendly expression, and most of the time she would just roll her eyes at him. Even though she always considered herself as his aide, Brando felt that this was not the attitude that a retainer should have when talking to their lord. Of course he would not bring it up. Using his status as a noble to pressure a weak girl was something that he would not do even if he was half a modern person. If you don't have a monthly ticket, a recommendation ticket is also fine. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 205. You're willing to talk to me now? He asked. Brando glanced at the refugees and did not find her question strange. In this place, even life itself was so fragile that it was worthless. Amandina would never have thought that you could get a boy for the price of a sheep. If it was a girl, the price would be even lower. With a little bit of power, you could trample on the existence of others. Bandits and lords were both killing people. The only difference was that one was outside the city, while the other was inside the city. Even if you killed someone on the streets, You would only need to compensate the local lord with a little money. In fact, he might even want you to kill a few more people. In the eyes of some lords, real gold coins were much more attractive than those who needed money to feed. Amandina was slightly surprised. She thought that Brando was dissatisfied with her previous performance, and although she felt wronged, she still lowered her head and replied, "I'm sorry, my lord, I was too stubborn." Brando spread out his hands. "You misunderstood, I never blamed you, Miss Amandina." Amandina raised her head and looked at him as if to confirm the truth of his words. But then she lowered her head again and did not say a word. "If it's our territory, we need to go further south," Brando replied. "South?" Amandina was really stunned. "Once we leave Tanajul, we'll be in the wilderness." "Have you heard of the Pioneer Knight, Amandina?" Brando asked. "Ah." Amandina could not help but cry out. How could she not know this? Those young nobles who did not have a territory to inherit, the knight, obtained the right to expand the territory of the kingdom from the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and brought a few squires to the wilderness to open up a new territory with their own strength. This kind of story sounded like a fairy tale from the past. But she never thought that this kind of legend would actually happen to her. At first she felt a little flustered. After all, opening up a territory in the wilderness sounded good, but in reality, it was an extremely dangerous thing. This kind of laborious and unrewarding thing had not been done in Erewhon for 100 or 200 years, so at this moment, it sounded a little bit like a fantasy story. But she immediately calmed down. So what if it was dangerous? Compared to her old house in Brugloss that was on the verge of collapse and living a life that was similar to these people's, there was at least a glimmer of hope for the latter. She could not help but look at Brando again. The title of the Pioneer Knight in Erewhon sounded like a classical hero, full of the spirit of enterprise. Even though it was dangerous, it was romantic. Not to mention that no matter what aspect, this lord met the ideal in her heart. It was a pity that he already had someone he liked. Amandina lowered her eyelashes. She could not help but feel a little moved. She then looked at the Roman beside her. This merchant lady had a bad record of wandering around in dangerous battlefields twice, and had been thoroughly taught a lesson by Brando. She was still well behaved at the moment. But at this moment, her eyes were focused on another side, and she spoke to the youth beside her in a crisp voice. "Brando, look over there." This young lady seemed to have a natural ability to attract people's attention, causing Amandina and Brando to turn their heads at the same time and look in the direction she was pointing at. There were many foreign travelers on the streets just like them. In fact, ever since Brando's earth-shattering divine artifact reaction last month, the news that a divine artifact had appeared in Count Ranner's taverns and inns had spread like wildfire. Wandering bards brought this news to the north, and adventurers who wanted to try their luck flocked to this place. Mercenaries, adventurers, and even bounty hunters who heard the news were like hyenas or sharks that smelled blood. They had already packed up and gathered here. Even the Council of Stars and Moon and the Black Tower had sent out scouts. Even though the nobles were enthusiastic about Erewhon's impending storm, they still sent out their own spies, and in a short period of time, Count Ranner's territory was a step ahead of Graf, Princess Regent's territory. In just half a month, the number of people in this area had at least doubled. This was because Tanajul was constantly facing the threat of war, and there was a certain degree of risk involved. If not, this place would definitely be a paradise for adventurers. If it was a more peaceful time, the local lords would definitely be smiling from ear to ear. But now, the situation had become somewhat complicated. Brando's gaze swept across these people one by one, as if his identity as a noble was completely different from these people. These adventurers were also out of place with the locals around them. They stood in the middle of the street, as if there were 3 different worlds existing on the street at the same time. It felt as if 3 different types of people were depicted in the same painting using 3 completely different styles of expression. Their movements were distinct. The adventurers and the locals had nothing to do with each other, and the locals were not willing to provoke these lawless people. At least most of them were. But the part that the Roman pointed out was an exception. Brando could see a small group of adventurers distributing food to the skinny local children. This scene made him feel as if time had reversed, as if he had returned to the world of the Amber Sword, and the players who were overly sympathetic back then were doing the same thing. But he quickly shook his head and threw away this unrealistic fantasy. Even though most adventurers were mercenaries, there were still some young people who went out to adventure for their dreams. Just like the 4 men and 2 women in front of him. Young people indeed. Brando couldn't help but think. Adventuring was actually not as romantic and full of swords as mentioned in bedtime stories. Of course, it was not a lie to say that it was full of swords and blades. However, the life of an adventurer was actually harsh and bloody, and they often had to go to those dangerous places. Just like mercenaries, life and death were very common. And compared to the risks, the benefits were pitifully low. Although there was no shortage of people who became rich overnight, most of them without exception ended up as a pile of bones in some unknown place. Because of this, most adventurers had to become practical and mercenary. And only young people would act with unrealistic ideals. Brando could even speculate that these young people might not have really started their travels for long. Otherwise, they might as well be the descendants of wealthy merchants or nobles. But he first turned around and asked, "What are you looking at?" But then he saw the beautiful dark brown gem-like eyes of the merchant lady turn around, as if a creative idea had been born, and he felt that something was wrong. "What do you want to do?" Brando couldn't help but ask a little warily. The little Roman's extraordinary way of doing things made him involuntarily vigilant. "That's it," the Roman answered matter-of-factly. "Romaine, we don't have much food left." Amandina seemed to understand Romaine's thoughts in an instant and reminded her in a low voice, "We have so many people and horses, so our consumption is not a small amount. If we want to buy so much food from the local area, we have to deal with the local lord. Did you forget last time?" Amandina was talking about when they passed by a small noble's territory not too long ago. Brando went to buy food from the noble, but the noble took a fancy to Scarlet and sent his personal guards to kidnap her that night. Although the 30 iron-ranked personal guards overestimated their abilities in front of Brando, and in the end they were completely defeated by the young man, and they were also ruthlessly extorted, this incident was a wake-up call to everyone. Even though the kingdom had yet to collapse, the local lords were already acting without restraint. Hearing Amandina's words, Brando couldn't help but look at the girl with a touched expression. The last time it was still fine because it was a nameless noble, but this time it was Baron Grodin. Even though this fellow was not worth mentioning in Erwin's history, his father, Count Randner, was not an ordinary person. If he brought his men today, it would be a scene of the Count's army chasing after him tomorrow. He even suspected that Duke Lone's army could come and go as they pleased in Count Randner's territory. Perhaps the princess faction of the royal faction had some sort of agreement with Count Randner himself. At the very least, there was no lack of secret alliances. Of course, he would have to deal with these vampires one by one sooner or later, but that would have to wait until he was fully grown and had the right to speak. Even though it was not pleasant to hear, strength was still one of the most important laws in this world. Unexpectedly, the Roman shook her head happily after hearing Amandina's words. She said with a mysterious expression, "Brando, Amandina, didn't you notice?" "What did you notice?" "The way to do business." "Huh?" Brando couldn't help but touch the girl's flat forehead. "Is she having a fever?" The younger of the wild elementalist sisters widened her eyes and asked curiously, "There's a saying in my hometown, merchants do not walk with poverty. Miss Roman, is there a business opportunity in such a poor place?" "Tia." The elder sister, Falerne, glared at her sternly. The elven girl was so frightened that she stuck out her tongue and swallowed the rest of her words. However, the Roman did not care about the girl's rebuttal and replied as if it was a matter of fact. "You can't say that. My aunt said that if there's a place for trade, there's a place for merchants." "That's true." Amandina shook her head. She knew that Tia was not wrong. Not only was this place poor, but it was also backward and isolated. There were no special products, and there wasn't even a road for carriages to pass through. Business was just a very distant term. But this place even lacks the necessary conditions for trade. "Is that so? But isn't that a trade?" Amandina looked at the actions of the group of young adventurers and asked with interest. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 206. Isn't that an exchange? Romaine looked at the group of young adventurers and asked with interest. "Rather than an exchange, it's more like charity, Miss Roman," Sanford answered from behind. The Roman tapped his chin with his finger, "But it's clearly an exchange. Using food to buy hope, isn't that an exchange?" "Using food to buy hope? What does that mean?" Amandina was confused. In fact, it wasn't just her. Everyone was puzzled by Sanford's words. "This is an exchange? Wait a minute." Only Brando reacted at this moment. He couldn't help but look at the Roman in disbelief. What's wrong with this guy's little brain? How can he always think of things that normal people can't? He immediately organized his thoughts and asked, "Amandina, if this territory is given to you to govern, how long will it take for you to have a spontaneous business here?" Amandina heard the question and immediately understood that Brando's words had a hidden meaning. She couldn't help but look at him. Does this young lord have some thoughts about this territory? Or is this just a test for me? Regardless, she looked at the ragged clothes on the streets and pondered for a moment. She answered with some difficulty, if it's short, it'll take a year. If it's long, it'll take 2 years. The people won't have any wealth and lack the foundation for business. Even if we reinstitute the taxes and distribute the land, it will take a long time to accumulate wealth. But no matter what, I'm confident that within 2 years, there will be business here again. The only problem is that the roads are a little troublesome. I'm afraid that rebuilding the roads will require a large amount of money. So, if we distribute the wealth, won't the people have wealth? The Roman interrupted her and said as if it was a matter of fact. Amandina was stunned. This? Is there any meaning to it? She couldn't help but ask with some difficulty, what's the difference between this and the gambling addicts lending their money to those who don't have money to gamble with them? In the end, what they win is their own money and there's even the risk of losing it. She couldn't help but look at the Roman as if she was looking at those gambling addicts. But there was a different way to put it. Gambling addicts? Of course it's meaningful. Look, didn't Amandina say borrow? Therefore, that cute gambler can still win more money in the end. It's just that the money is written on the IOU. But those people are still poor. So what if they have an IOU? In reality, they still don't have a single cent, Amandina retorted. The Roman lifted her chin and wagged her finger. In Brando's eyes, her action made him think that she was a capitalist who did things neatly and efficiently. Indeed, but not everyone wants to be poor, right? When we distribute our wealth, it's actually a form of exchange. We're buying their hopes for the future. The Roman pointed at his eyes. See? Everyone wants to live a better life. What we give them is the ability to realize this hope. It should be called the ability to participate in production, right? And when they realize this wish, they'll naturally fulfill the meaning of the IOU, and I'll also have many more partners in this game. Romain continued to describe, unlike gambling, if you bury gold coins in the ground, you'll get 2 gold coins in the coming year. She even winked playfully as she said this. It's like that, but it's difficult to implement. Although the others were still confused, Amandina finally understood the Roman's idea. However, no matter what, she could not accept such unconstrained logic. It's indeed difficult. Brando nodded, and then he couldn't help but look at the little Roman with admiration. In fact, the Roman's idea wasn't so much an exchange, but a form of redistribution. The only thing that participated in the redistribution was not only the means of production, but also the capital itself. When the capital participated in the reproduction of production, it would quickly increase in value. The Romans' idea was based on the premise that all the wealth in the territory belonged to the Lord himself. Although it was simple, to be able to think of such a problem under such conditions, it had to be said that his vision was quite advanced. But it did require an extremely large plan and consideration at every step. It wasn't as simple as distributing the goods. Brando wasn't good at this, but he had a simple example to learn from. Infrastructure and external warfare. Rather than buying hope, it's more like buying labor. Although labor is an additional value to the Lord, they don't understand that although all the wealth in the territory belongs to the Lord himself, the speed at which new wealth is created is different. Brando replied, of course, if you want to do this, the key is how to distribute the wealth. Amandina, do you have any ideas? The young man asked casually. Repair the road. Amandina's idea was simply the same as her lord's. She hesitated for a moment, then finally lowered her voice and whispered, My lord, what do you think of this place? In the past, Amandina would never have dared to imagine that she would instigate her lord to attack another legitimate lord of the kingdom, and seize the opportunity to seize the other's territory. This was a blatant act of treason. But as time passed, the situation in the ancient kingdom worsened day by day. There were already rumors of unrest outside, and after witnessing the actions of these cold-blooded and corrupt nobles, her last hope for the kingdom was a little disillusioned. Brando nodded, then shook his head. Of course he had his own ideas. Grodin's territory was close to his own in the future, and he wasn't a good person either. When the time came, he would naturally be the first to take action. But now was not the time. He didn't have the strength to do so, and he also lacked the opportunity. He would wait for another 2 months until the November coup, also known as the December coup. The various territories would declare their independence, and no one would care about the conflict between the lords of the southern border. But he did have a headache. He had to admit that Tanajil was one of the most barren territories in Erewhon at this time of the year. He was originally afraid that the Roman would be restricted in this place, but he didn't expect Amandina's instincts to be so strong that she could be used in any place. Brando even suspected that if he threw the little Roman into the underworld, she would still be able to happily do business with the demons. But no matter what, after having a preliminary idea, the only thing left was to perfect it, and the problem of money. Money was not a problem for Brando for the time being. The money he got from extorting the nobleman and the money Bragg sent over would be his starting capital, and the rest would be given to the rich mineral resources in the south. As a transmigrator, Brando felt that he had wasted his life if he couldn't do something about the mineral resources. But right at this moment, a loud crack of a horsewhip interrupted his train of thought. Brando snapped out of his daze and turned around with the others. He saw a small group of cavalrymen entering the city. Their equipment was a mess, but their banners were clear. The emblem on their banners was a pelican on a black and white checkered pattern. The background color was derived from Count Randner's family emblem, which meant that this group of noblemen was directly related to Count Randner. Brando immediately understood that these cavalrymen were Count Grodin's private soldiers. At this moment, the cavalrymen were raising their whips to chase away the citizens on both sides of the street. If they were slow to retreat, they would be severely whipped. Those sallow and emaciated men and women were driven away in all directions like a herd of animals. This scene seemed to be very interesting in the eyes of the riders. They could not help but laugh out loud, and even laughed until they were swaying left and right. Amandina furrowed her brows. This was a common sight to her. Bragg's cavalrymen were also arrogant and domineering. She heard the red-haired girl beside her snort coldly. They seemed to be dragging something behind them. Sanford suddenly pointed behind the cavalrymen and said, "It's a corpse." Brando replied, "These noblemen's private soldiers went out to suppress the bandits." He sighed lightly after he finished speaking. "What's wrong?" Amandina was surprised. "Isn't this a normal thing?" But Brando waved his hand to signal her not to speak, and pointed in a direction for her. Amandina looked closely and saw a group of women kneeling on the ground after seeing the corpses. They covered their faces and wept. Amandina was slightly taken aback and asked in confusion, "What's going on?" Rather than bandits, it's better to say that they're farmers who are forced to the point of being unable to survive because of the Lord's taxes. It would be better to say that the bandits in the forest outside were refugees avoiding taxes. In fact, most of their lives were no different from that of ordinary farmers. There were not many people who actually participated in robbing. It's only because of tax evasion that they're classified as inhuman. He gritted his teeth and said, "My father died in this way too. These despicable nobles." "You're right. You're right. You're right. Only men?" Amandina took a deep breath and asked. "Of course, life outside is not paradise." Brando nodded. After he finished speaking, the surroundings seemed to have fallen into a strange silence. Other than the scolding of the nobles' private soldiers and the sobbing of the women, no one else spoke. Of course, subscriptions are essential too. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 207. Isn't that an exchange? Romain looked at the group of young adventurers and asked with interest. "Rather than an exchange, it's more like charity, Miss Roman." Sanford answered from behind. The Roman tapped his chin with his finger, "But it's clearly an exchange. Using food to buy hope, isn't that an exchange?" "Using food to buy hope? What does that mean?" Amandina was confused. In fact, it wasn't just her. Everyone was puzzled by Sanford's words. "This is an exchange? Wait a minute." Only Brando reacted at this moment. He couldn't help but look at the Roman in disbelief. What's wrong with this guy's little brain? How can he always think of things that normal people can't? He immediately organized his thoughts and asked, "Amandina, if this territory is given to you to govern, how long will it take for you to have a spontaneous business here?" Amandina heard the question and immediately understood that Brando's words had a hidden meaning. She couldn't help but look at him. Does this young lord have some thoughts about this territory? Or is this just a test for me? Regardless, she looked at the ragged clothes on the streets and pondered for a moment. She answered with some difficulty, "If it's short, it'll take a year. If it's long, it'll take 2 years. The people won't have any wealth and lack the foundation for business. Even if we reinstitute the taxes and distribute the land, it will take a long time to accumulate wealth. But no matter what, I'm confident that within 2 years, there will be business here again. The only problem is that the roads are a little troublesome. I'm afraid that rebuilding the roads will require a large amount of money. So, if we distribute the wealth, won't the people have wealth?" The Roman interrupted her and said as if it was a matter of fact. Amandina was stunned. "This? Is there any meaning to it?" She couldn't help but ask with some difficulty, "What's the difference between this and the gambling addicts lending their money to those who don't have money to gamble with them? In the end, what they win is their own money and there's even the risk of losing it." She couldn't help but look at the Roman as if she was looking at those gambling addicts. But there was a different way to put it. Gambling addicts. Of course it's meaningful. Look, didn't Amandina say borrow? Therefore, that cute gambler can still win more money in the end. It's just that the money is written on the IOU. But those people are still poor. So what if they have an IOU? In reality, they still don't have a single cent, Amandina retorted. The Roman lifted her chin and wagged her finger. In Brando's eyes, her action made him think that she was a capitalist who did things neatly and efficiently. Indeed, but not everyone wants to be poor, right? When we distribute our wealth, it's actually a form of exchange. We are buying their hopes for the future. The Roman pointed at his eyes. See? Everyone wants to live a better life. What we give them is the ability to realize this hope. It should be called the ability to participate in production, right? And when they realize this wish, they will naturally fulfill the meaning of the IOU, and I will also have many more partners in this game. Romain continued to describe, unlike gambling, if you bury the gold coins in the ground, you will get 2 gold coins in the next year. She even winked playfully as she said this. It's like that, but it's difficult to implement. Although the others were still confused, Amandina finally understood the Roman's idea. But she couldn't accept this kind of unconstrained logic no matter what. It is indeed difficult. Brando nodded, and then he couldn't help but look at the little Roman with admiration. In fact, the Roman's idea wasn't so much an exchange, but a form of redistribution. The only thing that participated in the redistribution was not only the means of production, but also the capital itself. When the capital participated in the reproduction of production, it would quickly increase in value. The Roman's idea was based on the premise that all the wealth in the territory belonged to the Lord himself. Although it was simple, to be able to think of such a problem under such conditions, it had to be said that the Romans' vision was quite advanced. But it did require an extremely large plan and consideration at every step. It wasn't as simple as distributing the goods. Brando wasn't good at this, but he had a simple example to learn from. Infrastructure and external warfare. Rather than buying hope, it's more like buying labor. Although labor is an additional value to the Lord, they don't understand that although all the wealth in the territory belongs to the Lord himself, there is a difference in the speed of creating new wealth. Brando replied, "Of course, if you want to do this, the key is how to distribute the wealth." "Amandina, do you have any ideas?" the young man asked casually. "Repair the road." Amandina's idea was simply the same as her lord's. She hesitated for a moment, then finally lowered her voice and whispered, "My lord, what do you think of this place?" In the past, Amandina would never have dared to imagine that she would incite her lord to attack another legitimate lord of the kingdom, and seize the opportunity to seize the other's territory. This was a blatant act of treason. But as time passed, the situation in the ancient kingdom worsened day by day. There were already rumors of unrest outside, and after witnessing the actions of these cold-blooded and corrupt nobles, her last hope for the kingdom was a little disillusioned. Brando nodded, then shook his head. Of course he had his own ideas. Baron Grodin's territory was close to his own in the future, and he wasn't a good person either. When the time came, it was needless to say that Grodin would be the first to act. But now was not the time. He lacked the strength and the opportunity to do so. He would wait for another 2 months until the November coup, also known as the December coup. The various territories would declare their independence, and no one would care about the conflict between the lords of the southern border. But he did have a headache. He had to admit that Tanajul was one of the most barren territories in Erewhon at this time of the year. He was originally afraid that the Roman would be restricted in this place, but he didn't expect Amandina's instincts to be so strong that she could be used anywhere. Brando even suspected that if he threw the little Roman into the underworld, she would still be able to do business with the demons happily. But no matter what, now that he had a preliminary idea, the only thing left was to perfect it, and the problem of money. Money was not a problem for Brando at the moment. The money he got from extorting the noblemen and the money Bragg sent over would be his starting capital, and the rest would be given to the rich mineral resources in the south. As a transmigrator, Brando felt that he had lived in vain if he couldn't do something about the mineral resources. But right at this moment, a loud crack of a horsewhip interrupted his train of thought. Brando snapped out of his daze and turned around with the others. He saw a small group of cavalrymen entering the city. Their equipment was a mess, but their banners were clear. The emblem on their banners was a pelican on a black and white checkered pattern. The background color was derived from Count Randner's family emblem, which meant that this group of noblemen was directly related to Count Randner. Brando immediately understood that these cavalrymen were Count Grodin's private soldiers. At this moment, the cavalrymen were raising their whips and driving away the citizens on both sides of the street. Anyone who was slow in retreating would be severely whipped. Those sallow and emaciated men and women were driven away in all directions like a herd of animals. This scene seemed to be very interesting in the eyes of the riders. They could not help but laugh out loud and even laughed until they were swaying left and right. Amandina furrowed her brows. This was a common sight to her. Braggs's cavalrymen were also arrogant and domineering. She then heard Scarlet, the red-haired girl beside her, snort coldly. They seemed to be dragging something behind them. Sanford suddenly pointed at the back of the cavalrymen and said, "They're corpses." Brando replied, "These noblemen's private soldiers went out to suppress the bandits." He sighed lightly after he finished speaking. "What's wrong?" Amandina was surprised. "Isn't this normal?" Brando waved his hand to signal her not to speak and pointed at the corpses. Amandina looked carefully and saw a group of women kneeling on the ground and covering their faces as they wept. She was slightly surprised and asked in confusion, "What's going on?" Rather than bandits, it's better to say that they're farmers who are forced to the point of no return by the Lord's taxes. It's better to say that the bandits in the forest are refugees who are avoiding taxes. Their lives are no different from that of farmers, and there aren't many who actually participate in robbing. It's only because they're evading taxes that they're considered non-humans. One of the Grey Wolves mercenaries was very familiar with all of this. He gritted his teeth and replied, "My father also died like this, these despicable nobles, only men?" Amandina took a deep breath and asked, "Of course life outside is not paradise." Brando nodded. After he finished speaking, the surroundings fell into a strange silence. Other than the curses of the noblemen's private soldiers and the weeping of the women, no one else spoke for a while. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 208. There was a dead silence. "Dad?" A sudden cry from the crowd broke the silence. The voice was young and nervous. The woman covered the boy's mouth in panic. She raised her head and looked at the approaching noble cavalryman with pleading eyes. The man's face was filled with a mixture of surprise and surprise, but he could not hide the disdain in his eyes. "Do you know this person?" The man licked his lips and pointed at the blood-stained corpse on the ground with his spear. The noble cavalryman's companions surrounded them like a pack of hyenas that smelled blood. The woman hugged her child and shook her head helplessly with tears streaming down her face. "Let go of the little thing and let him speak," the man said as he used the tip of his spear to stroke the woman's hair. The woman hugged her child even tighter, as if she was hugging her most important treasure and was afraid of losing it. The people around them could not bear to see her like this, but they moved away from her. "Didn't you hear what I said? Sir, please let him go. He is still young," the woman begged as she sobbed. The noble cavalryman snorted in disdain. "Bitch." He raised his spear, but he found a woman with a longbow standing in front of him with her arms open. "Huh." The man's fierce-looking face was startled. Brando secretly loosened his fingers on the hilt of his sword. He recognized that the man who stepped forward was the young man who distributed the food. "Enough. What's the big deal about bullying a woman?" The female archer who stopped the noble cavalryman said angrily, "I am the daughter of a noble. I order you to stop immediately." The noble cavalryman was stunned for a moment. He then turned to his companions and said, "Hey, this girl is the daughter of a noble. What do you think we should do?" The cavalryman laughed in a low voice. "Where is your father from?" The man raised his chin and asked disdainfully. When he asked this question, the female archer's companions realized that something was wrong. "Faya, be careful." A swordsman with a great sword and heavy armor stepped out from the crowd. But it was a little too late. The leader of the noble cavalrymen had already pierced the woman's lower abdomen with his spear. The female archer did not expect that Roland would dare to attack her. She groaned in disbelief and looked at the wound on her lower abdomen. Blood gushed out like a fountain. The pain that followed soon drowned her. The woman staggered and lost her strength. She knelt down in a pool of blood. It seemed that she would not survive. The man withdrew his spear indifferently, as if what he did was not a big deal. At the same time, the noble cavalrymen behind him took down their longbows and shot at the adventurers in the crowd. For a moment, arrows rained down, and more than a dozen adventurers and civilians in the crowd fell. The noble cavalrymen did not care if they hurt the innocent. They drove the crowd away from them as quickly as possible to avoid any sudden attacks. Fire! The swordsman with the big sword was furious. He swept away the arrow that was flying towards him, but before he could finish his words, one of his companions behind him was also hit by an arrow and fell down. You bastards! The swordsman roared and separated the crowd. He slashed his sword at the man in the lead. The horseman raised his spear and blocked the swordsman's sword with a clang. In between parries he shouted coldly, "Whoever dares to attack will be the enemy of the Lord." The restless crowd fell silent. The swordsman did not say a word. He swept his sword at the horse's leg. But the horseman simply thrust his spear down and swept it outwards, knocking the sword away from the swordsman's hand. He then used his spear to make the swordsman do a somersault and stab the man's neck. The strength of an iron-ranked warrior was almost one-sided. However, the fierce-looking noble cavalryman suddenly felt his hand go numb. It was as if a huge force came from the spear, and he almost lost his grip. Clang! The sound of metal colliding was heard. The spear that was aimed at the swordsman had been deflected to one side and missed the latter's neck. Who? The man was furious. He turned around and saw a young man wearing a black trench coat, a white shirt and a pair of white gloves. He was putting away the longbow in his hand. Then the young man raised his head and looked at him coldly. The crowd fell silent. Amandina, Sanford, the Nightsong Tiger, and Scarlet turned around and looked at their lord in shock. In their hearts, Brando was not a person who liked to cause trouble. But Brando knew that it was not that he did not care about these things. It was just that he did not cross the bottom line in his heart. The Roman looked at the man who brought her out of Bucci with interest. She felt that this was the real Brando. Perhaps in a way she could understand some of Brando's thoughts and characteristics. It was as if the two of them were detached from this world. Just like the moment Fortress Reedon brought the refugees to escape, Romaine understood it. Her Brando was a true knight. The Brando who charged, the Brando who led, the murderous Brando who was filled with killing intent, and the Brando who was fierce to her. She liked every single one of them. Everyone turned around. It was as if their line of sight had been stretched and expanded. The young man wearing a black windbreaker became the center of attention on the street. The man with the fierce-looking face narrowed his eyes. He saw the well-equipped guards beside Brando and was secretly shocked. As the private soldiers of the nobles, they were not truly insignificant. Compared to the noble lady who might not have suffered any setbacks, of course in his opinion, she was insignificant. What could a mere daughter of a knight represent here? Countless people died in Tanajil every day. Would a small noble like her dare to seek justice in front of the Baron? But the young man in front of him was different. Normal people would not bring so many followers with them. Moreover, the guards beside him were not weak. They were at the level of the elites in Erwin's army. He was probably not an ordinary noble's son. The man did not dare to delay and hurriedly put away his spear. He asked cautiously, "You are?" When he said this, the noble's cavalry stood in a circle. They drew their bows and aimed at the people around them. The cold light from the arrows calmed the hot-headed people down. "Let them go," Brando said coldly without even looking at the archers. What a joke. With Scarlet and the Nightsong Tiger by his side, it would be ridiculous if he or the people around him got shot. Moreover, he was not weak himself. After bidding farewell to the Elven Hymn Legion, he received the perfect storyline reward. More than 200,000 EXP was like a pie that fell from the sky, directly pushing his mercenary level to level 25. When his character level reached level 32, his strength and vitality had broken through 70, and his dexterity had also surpassed 40. His overall strength had entered the upper tier of silver. But in order to reach the gold rank, it involved the understanding of the elements. Not only did it require an increase in physical strength, it also required a high level of perception. Brendel estimated that if he wanted to break through the silver rank and enter the gold rank, he would have to wait until his overall level was around 40. However, even if he was only at the upper silver rank, he would still be able to kill 10 of these nobles' cavalry. That was why he was too lazy to talk to them. If it wasn't for Groton, he would have sent them flying 100 meters away with his sword. My lord, you're making things difficult for us. Brando's indifference confirmed the noble's suspicions. The noble's ferocious expression became respectful. These people might be the accomplices of the bandits outside the city. If we let them go, we won't be able to explain ourselves to the Baron. However, he still chose to fight rather than cooperate. After all, they had killed a noble's daughter. If the noble's companions spread the news, it would be troublesome. Brando sneered, "Put away your tricks. Who do you think you're talking to?" The young man held his sword with one hand and stared at the noble. "I'll kill you like I'm killing a dog. I'll just apologize to Groton afterwards. I'm giving him face by not killing you, but there's a limit to my tolerance." When he finished speaking, he unsheathed half of his sword. The blade of the sword shone with a snowy light. The noble's cavalry was stunned. Brendel was right. This world was just so realistic. There was no difference in the value of a person's life. The only thing left was the difference in power. The only difference was that the girl they killed could not resist. Naivety was precious, but the price to pay was also heavy. The cold-blooded people looked at each other and could only choose to show weakness. They nodded, and the people behind them finally let go of the swordsman's neck. The swordsman wanted to resist, but someone rushed out from the crowd and hugged him. It was one of his companions. Brando saw that person whispered something into his ears, and the swordsman finally calmed down. He read the words clearly, "Don't cause trouble for others." Brando sighed in his heart. What a bunch of naive people. But in this world it's rare and precious. He saw the people silently put away their companion's corpse, then separated the crowd and came to his side. "Thank you, sir." The one who thanked him was a thin young man. His face was pale and he had light gray hair. He wore a monocle with a silver chain behind his ear. The young man wore a gray gown, and from the patterns on his cuffs, he was an acolyte. Flux wizard. Brando thought to himself. There aren't many wizards who practice this. This young man appeared polite and cold, but he caught a hint of anger in his eyes. Brando looked at his companions, including a light swordsman and a female elementalist. Grief and indignation were written all over their faces. This is a character. He lowered his head to look at the polite young man and could not help but think. "Want to take revenge?" he asked. The young man was slightly surprised and raised his head to look at him suspiciously. Then, the young acolyte shook his head and left the crowd with his companions. Brando looked at the others back and knew that the other party was not willing to give up. He just didn't trust him. However, he was somewhat surprised that there was such a character in this group of naive youngsters. He turned his head to look at the noble's cavalry. "My lord, we've done what we should do. Now you have to give us an explanation, right?" The leader of the cavalry spread out his hands and asked carefully. Brando snorted in disdain. "My lord?" Amandina asked in a low voice. He nodded. Since he had interfered in this matter, it was necessary to meet with Baron Groton. After all, he was in Groton's territory. Otherwise, it would not be good if he was invited by force. Rather than that, it was better to be one step ahead and not let Groton know of his background. Baron Groton? Brando thought in his heart. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 209. Naturally, a group of nobles had no right to bring them to meet the local lord, a baron of Erewhon. Although Brando called himself Viscount Stettingen, a noble from the north, and the seal that Roan forged for him was even more exquisite and authentic than the one issued by the Parliament of Nobles. However, nobles had their own pride, and it was necessary for both parties to wait for a while. The streets of Ferber were spread out in a net, the tiles of the ochre terracotta of the south, so that the vermilion roofs looked down upon them, and the baron's castle was in the center of them all. There was an inn called the Valiant Fist in the center of the city, and they could see the tall spires of the castle. Since Anson's time, humans had often built castles like this. In the wilderness, humans relied on castles and fortresses to defend against the attacks of beasts, monsters, and barbarians. After Brando and the rest had their meal in the inn, Baron Groton's formal invitation arrived. Under the guidance of a group of nobles' private soldiers, they entered the castle. However, there was no good banquet. The moment they entered the castle gate, the first thing they saw were 2 rows of elite guards in heavy armor, holding long halberds in their hands and standing in neat rows. They were expressionless. Brando looked around and thought to himself, what an ostentatious display. It's obvious that they're trying to show us who's boss. What's so funny is that we've even seen the ancient guards of the Silver Elves before. The young man ignored them and walked past them. A burly man with a scar on his face flashed out from the side. The moment he appeared, he reached out to grab Brendel's shoulder, as if he wanted to make him stay. Unfortunately, before he could do so, his wrist was grabbed by the red-haired girl behind Brando. Her amber eyes stared at him as if he was her prey. She said coldly, "Move." With a tug of her hand, Scarlet had already tossed the instructor out like a sandbag. Everyone heard a muffled sound, followed by a low howl of pain. "Stop him." The two rows of heavily armored soldiers' faces changed, and they immediately blocked the young man's path. They wanted to stop the young man who didn't stop, but the reality was cruel. Brando moved forward. As soon as these people touched him, they were immediately sent flying. It was as if they had not encountered a gentlemanly young noble, but a giant dragon. Strength 70 upper silver. If it was during Anson's era, Brando would be a member of the kingdom's young knight regiment. As long as he took this step, he would be able to enter the core of power in the upper circle. However, since he was born in a chaotic world, this path was different. But it would definitely press forward. Brando moved forward. For a moment, the courtyard was filled with a series of clattering noises. The heavily armored guards fell back and fell into a pile. However, the young man didn't even look at the wailing fellows lying on the ground. He walked straight to the second gate of the castle. The door was tightly shut. Perhaps the person who was about to open the door for him was lying on the ground, groaning. But it didn't matter. Since no one opened the door for him, Brando kicked the door open without hesitation. He remembered that this was how he entered the guild's meeting hall in the past. There was a loud bang and an empty hall appeared in front of him. Oh my, how rude. Behind one of the arched windows in the castle, a middle-aged man in a long robe lifted a corner of the curtain and looked at the scene below with interest. Even though he was sighing, his greenish-gray eyes glinted with a cold light. He held a goblet in his hand. In the goblet, there was a clear red liquid that resembled blood. The middle-aged man shook his wrist, causing the edges of the liquid to undulate and change, overlapping with the edges of the goblet. If Brando was here, he would have recognized the man's unique aquiline nose. It was as if he was a descendant of the Diener family, and only then could he have such a gloomy face. The middle-aged man's eyes were sunken, and his skin was pale and sickly like all nobles. His eyes lacked vitality, but his beard was full of vitality. He's at least a silver-ranked warrior about 20 years old. Grodin stroked his slightly curly goatee and asked, "What do you think?" A tall man behind him shook his head. He didn't use his full strength. That red-haired girl isn't simple either. But if you want to fight, it's 50-50. It's best if you don't fight. Of course. Grodin raised his goblet and clinked it against the glass window, making a light tinkling sound. "You know my name, yet you still dare to be so arrogant. You must have some background. But I still have to teach you a lesson. Let's mind our own business." He put down the curtain and turned around. "What about the matter I asked you to do?" The man bowed slightly. "I sent someone out this morning. If there are no accidents, they should be back in the evening." "That's good." Grodin threw the goblet out of his hand, and it landed beside a dead woman on the bed. Crimson-red liquid splashed out from the goblet and seeped into the fabric of the carpet. The already dark red carpet became even darker. "This is my father's request. Make sure it's done perfectly." He was thinking about when the old man would decide on his successor, but to his disappointment, Count Randner seemed to have become more shrewd as he got older. Otherwise he would have poisoned all his brothers to death a long time ago. Those fools. He thought to himself. In the middle of the hall, there was a chandelier made of dark red crystal. It was so exquisite that it was almost luxurious. There were runes in the crystal, so it was obviously a magical item. The decoration style of the dome was derived from the religious trend of the Anson era. From top to bottom, there were celestial bodies, legends, and scriptures of saints. At the bottom, there were 180 pillars that symbolized the 180 constellations. When Brando saw Grodin, both of them sat at opposite ends of a long table in the middle of the hall. Grodin sat under the dagger throne, while Brando sat under the Witch King throne, which was the only constellation in the south. Other than Grodin's knight, most of the guests were local nobles. Most of them were Grodin's right-hand men, with the exception of a few who were titled nobles after the Corvado dynasty. But Brando knew that Grodin's most trusted aides were not here. Those people were either hiding their heads and showing their tails, or they were simply helping him rule a region. Even though Tanajul was not big, it contained more than 20 territories of various sizes. Each territory was ruled by a loyal retainer, and it was a tradition in Won to divide the land layer by layer. After the two parties exchanged pleasantries, the Baron announced the start of the banquet. The purpose of the banquet was naturally to welcome the so-called Viscount Tingen. The dishes served by the servants were sumptuous, but Brando and the rest ate like they were chewing wax. Scarlet and the Nightsong Tiger did not even have the mood to eat. Amandina did not show it on her face, but she was nervous to death. She did not know how carefree Brando and the Roman were to be able to taste every dish on the table. She frowned as she looked at the dishes on the table. She was not in the mood to eat. During the banquet, the Baron noticed the expression on the noble lady's face. His expression changed slightly as he asked, "What's the matter? Does this young lady think that I have been a bad host?" The hall was silent. Amandina's heart skipped a beat, but she raised her head and calmly nodded. "My lord and mistress are unable to speak due to their statuses, but as a retainer I have no qualms. To be honest, these things are a little too common. Good job." She really did see through my act. Brendel thought to himself, "Good job. Good job." But her words were too good, and it was like a slap to Grodin's face. Even though he was not a good person, he could not refute her words. He was a lord, and it was not good for him to argue with a retainer, let alone a woman. Grodin only smiled faintly, while the others kept quiet out of fear. The middle-aged man stared at Brando with his sunken eyes, and Brando looked back at him with a belligerent gaze. Right now he was playing the role of a domineering, arrogant young aristocrat. Young nobles like him could be found everywhere in Erewhon, and it was because they were ordinary that they did not attract suspicion. According to the cripple, even if Viscount Tingen himself came to check the documents, he would first suspect himself, not Brando, of being a fake. This is the best. Even in the Brags, no, in the south, you won't be able to find a better craftsmanship than this. I spent a lot of money on it and it will guarantee you a smooth journey. That was how the man boasted. Grodin's face showed a gentle smile. "My lord, you came from the north and I'm sure you're not used to the weather in the south?" When he spoke he changed the topic. To a knight of the kingdom, a change in climate is nothing. As for those who can't even endure this little bit of hardship, I don't think they deserve to be called nobles. Brendel replied mercilessly. But he felt that this image was more in line with his nature. Is it possible that I'm actually a domineering person in my subconscious? Everyone in the hall was stunned. This was a slap in the face again and again, and they could not help but wonder who this young man was. Grodin was the only one with a smile on his face. His expression was so perfect that it was commendable. He smiled and said, "Young people can't be compared to us old bones, but it doesn't matter if you don't like the food. I have a gift for all of you." Gift? Brando was startled. What's this guy up to again? In fact, he wanted to scare Grodin and leave as soon as possible. His territory was just a few feet away, and it would not be too late to find trouble with him later. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 210. Grodin snapped his fingers while Brando was deep in thought. Two servants immediately brought out a wooden box. They cleared the table and placed the boxes in front of Brando, bowed slightly and left. The Baron stood up and gestured for Brando to open the box. "What is this?" Brando knew that the Baron would not give him anything good. Even though he was a Viscount, Grodin did not need to fawn over him. Moreover, he had slapped Grodin's face so hard just now, and the Baron was still trying to get back at him. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded to Amandina and signaled her to open the box. Amandina immediately stood up and opened the box. She was currently acting as a Viscount's attendant, so she had to act appropriately. She could not act like she usually did and ask for advice. But when Amandina opened the first box, her movements froze. From Brando's perspective, he could see that she was clenching her teeth to stop herself from screaming. What's going on? Amandina stood in front of the box for a long time, as if she was under some kind of spell. Brando could see her throat trembling slightly, as if she was making a soft cracking sound. Amandina took a deep breath and moved to the side in the end. The fork in the small Roman's hand fell on the plate with a clatter. Brando's expression changed in an instant. There was a human head in the box. To be exact, it was the head of the swordsman he had seen before. The swordsman's eyes were tightly shut, and his skin was as pale as a sheet of rubber. Brando remained silent. Amandina carefully glanced at him. She suppressed her emotions and finally opened the other box. Even though she was on the verge of breaking down, she still played her role as the main character. Her fingers were trembling so much that she could not hold the lid of the box. She calmed herself down and slowly opened the lid. There was another female elementalist's head inside. Amandina's face was pale. "That woman tastes good," Groudon replied with a smile, "but a gentleman doesn't take what others like. I heard that the wine cup made from a young girl's skull is exceptionally delicious. I don't think the Viscount has ever tried it. As for the other one, consider it a gift." Just as he finished speaking, everyone in the hall heard a soft buzzing sound. They immediately saw Brando's sword vibrating on its own as it unsheathed itself. It let out a sharp buzzing sound as if it was screaming for slaughter, but also as if it was about to shoot out in the next moment. The young man pressed both of his hands on the table and pursed his lips tightly. He didn't say a word, but everyone could feel a cold aura emanating from him. It was a killing intent that seemed to have materialized. The nobles sitting next to Brando were the first to bear the brunt. The knives and forks in their hands clattered to the ground. They were so shocked that they could not move at all. The knights drew their swords in an attempt to protect Groudon. Groudon, on the other hand, had a smile on his face as if he was enjoying the pleasure of toying with his opponents. However, the smile froze on his face as soon as it appeared. Almost everyone in the hall saw a layer of white frost climbing up the table. It started from Brando's front. The silver plates and porcelain plates cracked, and the pieces of porcelain shattered into powder. The white frost moved forward, and for a moment, the tableware on the long table exploded into a white mist. It was as if an invisible monster was crossing the table and heading straight for Groudon. The two knights in front of the Baron groaned as their swords broke into pieces. They screamed in pain and covered their eyes with their hands. Blood flowed out from the gaps between their fingers. However, the screams in the hall were not as sudden as the shock in everyone's hearts. There was only one word that came to everyone's mind when they saw this scene: elemental sensing. Even Brendel did not expect that he would be able to comprehend the meaning of elemental power while he was in the realm of Berserk. At that moment, he felt as if his mind was in a boundless darkness. Groudon's despicable and cowardly actions had crossed the bottom line in his heart. Brando felt disgusted. Indeed, it was a feeling of disgust that came from the depths of his heart. He looked at the man who was wearing the skin of a baron. His bones were filthy, and the hypocritical smile on his face seemed to be distorted into an absurd abstract picture. An impulse arose in his heart to make this filth completely disappear from this world. But from the boundless anger, Brendel came to another realization. It was not a cold killing intent, but a stillness. Space was still. Even though he was filled with anger, he had another thought to examine himself. This thought cleared his mind. It was as if he could see his anger from a transcendent perspective and calmly control it. In other words, it was as if there were two Brandos at this moment. One Brando was completely shrouded in a boundless killing intent, while the other Brando was calmly examining his anger from a transcendent perspective. Thus, Brando found that he could completely control the anger in his heart. He felt that his strength was increasing exponentially, and this realization merged with the one he gained from the battle with his grandfather. Brando finally touched a solid barrier. He knew. That was the elemental wall. The moment he touched the wall, he felt a few very fleeting words in his mind. Stillness, stillness, stability. Then the wall mercilessly bounced him back. Trying to break through to elemental awakening? You're not qualified. Then all the illusions collapsed and the world in his mind seemed to shatter into pieces. Time resumed its flow in an instant, pulling him back to reality. Then Brando heard the sound of frying beans. The glass and porcelain shattered in front of him. The temperature in the hall seemed to have dropped by a few dozen degrees, and a thick layer of frost formed on the walls. The first thing Brando did when he raised his head was to place his hand on the silver-plated sword hilt. With just this action, Groudon and the 20 knights behind him were forced to take a big step back by an invisible force. The chairs behind them cracked and shattered into pieces of wood like butterflies. "Protect me," Groudon screamed. Even though the knights around him felt uncomfortable, they had no choice but to pull out their swords to block Brendel's path once more. What awaited them was Brendel's ordinary sword strike. His thumb and index finger pressed against the crossguard, his little finger hooked around the hilt, and his middle finger, ring finger, and palm together stabilized the sword. He swung his wrists from left to right, and his elbows and shoulders drew a simple arc white raven sword style. Power burst. No matter how one looked at it, this was the most basic swordsmanship. It was like the first strike of a novice swordsman. The trajectory was clear and the intent was obvious. Even an experienced swordsman would be able to predict where this strike was going to come from. However, none of the 20 iron-ranked knights had the ability to dodge it. That sword seemed to be stretched in the air, and the frightening cold light on the blade made everyone feel a bone-chilling coldness from their bones. The chill crept up their bodies and froze instantly, forming a thick layer of ice. Elemental energy ice. They couldn't move. A white light swept across them and 20 heads flew high into the air. At that moment almost everyone was dumbfounded. No, it wasn't just dumbfounded. They were so shocked that they couldn't control themselves. There was the sound of chairs and utensils being overturned. The nobles on both sides of the table hurriedly retreated and clung to the walls on both sides. They did not even care about the cold, as if they were afraid of being close to this terrifying young man. 20 ice sculptures fell down in front of him, turning into lifeless corpses. For the first time, the aura of death was displayed in front of Baron Groden. He had always been able to control the life and death of others, but at this moment he finally understood that when life was mercilessly taken away, the weaker party was as weak as a drowning man who couldn't fight back against fate. That was the deepest sorrow. The civilization that humans were most proud of was completely trampled on. He finally couldn't take it anymore. He thought that Brando was at most a silver-rank swordsman. This identity was only on the same level as him, so they could naturally use all kinds of methods to show off their strength. But now he realized that he was wrong. He wasn't a silver-ranked swordsman. He was a terrifying existence who had already touched the edge of elemental awakening. No, once elemental awakening was achieved, he was no longer human. The person sitting in front of him wasn't someone to be trifled with, but a giant beast that chose to devour people. Brando stood forward with a cold face, and the long table was split into two halves. The others didn't even see how he did it. They only saw the young man moving forward, and there was no longer any obstruction between him and the Baron. Brando didn't say a word, and his hand once again reached for the hilt of his sword. "I'm the Lord of the Kingdom." Groden was on the verge of breaking down. He looked around in panic, hoping to see someone come to his rescue. Unfortunately, there was no one. Everyone was scared silly. They didn't think that a good banquet would turn out like this. Or rather, they didn't think that a silver-ranked swordsman who had touched the edge of elemental awakening would come to such a remote place. Brando walked forward step by step, looking at the man as if he was looking at a dog. He lowered his hand, preparing to end the man's life. But at this moment, Brando felt a hand on his. He was slightly startled and turned his head to see Scarlet holding her halberd, looking at him with her amber eyes. Scarlet. The girl with the red ponytail looked at him and shook her head. P.S. For those who feel that the plot is not coherent, please continue reading. Due to the limited space of my daily updates, I cannot express everything that I want to express. The answers that you need will appear later. Chapter 211. Scarlet. The red-haired girl looked at him without saying a word and shook her head. When she raised her head, Brando saw something in her bright amber eyes. He turned around and saw an uninvited guest standing in the corridor on the second floor of the hall. Or rather, it was there all along, but he didn't notice it before. The tall skeleton held an axe in its hand, its body covered in old bronze armor. Its cracked jaws were slightly open, and the crack on its skull seemed to be mocking him. Cabias looked at him from above, the dark yellow flames in its eye sockets flickering. It recognized the young man that it saw from afar during the battle at Fortress Reden. Viscount Tingen? Cabias spoke with a hoarse voice. How have you been since we parted at Fortress Reden? Madare. Brendel ground out the words through gritted teeth. Madara's undead, why are they here? The young man looked at Groden coldly, his mind spinning rapidly as he asked coldly, since when did Madara and Erwin's nobles become like family? As time passes, all life will turn to dust. In this world, only benefits remain unchanged, Viscount. Cabias replied in a low voice. Its answer confirmed Brando's suspicions that Groden was in cahoots with Madara. But what do they want? Brendel raised his head and saw the tall skeleton's battle axe slanted between him and the despicable Baron. If he made a move, Cabias would not just stand by and watch. This one-eyed Tarkus's general, the Lord of the Dark Kingdom, was at least a gold-ranked warrior. On the other hand, he had only just touched the edge of the gold rank. Although the outcome of the battle was still unclear, it would not be difficult for the other party to stop him from killing someone right under his nose. Tarkus did things step by step and was known for his cautiousness. With Cabias here, there was no way he wouldn't provide support. Brando turned around and saw a pale young man in a gray robe walking out from the shadows. It was Rothko, another familiar face. Brando remembered the first time he met him in Bucci. He was just a lowly undead wizard apprentice, but now there were two purple flame emblems on his collar. A mid-ranked undead wizard. Brando fell silent and looked at Baron Grodin, who was not far away. The middle-aged man had also regained some of his composure from his earlier panic. The middle-aged man supported himself with one hand on the wood shavings and forced himself to remain calm. However, the bulging blood vessels under his greenish-gray skin exposed his inner nervousness. But Brendel's sword flickered, and a faint light shone from the silver blade into his eyes, causing him to shrink back slightly. Grodin realized that he was being toyed with. He was furious, but he did not show it on his face. "I didn't expect someone to sell their soul to the devil," Brando replied coldly. "You rotten skeletons are here to save this bastard's life, am I right?" Grodin seemed to have regained some of his confidence from his ally. He gritted his teeth like a wild beast and said in a low voice, "Young man, you can talk as much as you like. But you should know that even if you don't rely on me, Madara's allies, do you dare to go against the Randner family? Because of a momentary dispute, it will inevitably lead to a war between two families. In the end, Viscount Tingen, I believe your family won't allow you to neglect your duties to such an extent." Before he could finish, he was interrupted by Brando's cold snort. It was as if the temperature in the hall had dropped by a few degrees, and the air was so cold that it felt as if there were ice shards in the air. Other than the undead, almost everyone in the hall couldn't help but shiver. Grodin froze, and the rest of his words were stuck in his throat forever. It was as if he would never understand that he was wrong from the start. Brando was just an imposter. In fact, the young man's killing intent had already been ignited. He raised his sword and thrust it towards Grodin's throat like a silver thread. Grodin was stunned. He did not expect Brando to attack without warning. This was not normal. For a moment, Grodin was stunned and did not know how to dodge. If it wasn't for a heavy axe that fell from the sky and blocked Brando's sword, he would have been a corpse on the spot. "I think I've said before," Cabiaz's bony hands gripped the handle of his axe as he looked down at the young man, "Baron Grodin is an important ally of ours. We can't just hand him over to you so easily." "I'm sorry, but you didn't say that," Brando retorted, and both of them took a step back at the same time. Brando activated Strength Burst, and both of them took 3 steps back. Neither of them had the upper hand. "Young man, it's time for you to retreat." Cabiaz used his axe to support himself on the ground, then raised his head and said, "Madara and Erwin have already stopped fighting. Why do you have to start a war between you and the Baron? With such a large commotion in the hall, there's no way the guards outside didn't notice. Aren't you worried about the servants you left in the courtyard?" Brando's expression darkened, and he was about to attack again. "Mr. Brando." But the red-haired girl grabbed his sleeve and gritted her teeth. Sanford and the rest of the Grey Wolves mercenaries were still outside. "Miss Amandina, do you also think that I shouldn't kill this scum?" Brando asked coldly. The noble lady was slightly startled, and only then did she recover from her momentary absent-mindedness. She looked at Grodin, who was sitting on the ground with an ugly expression. She wanted to stomp on his face to show that she was different from Grodin, but she managed to suppress the discomfort in her heart and replied, "Yes, Grodin. Grodin's face is a human. My lord, this bastard is still the lord of the kingdom." Amandina's words had a hidden meaning. She was pointing out Grodin's identity to Brando. This was not the first time the nobles attacked each other, and as long as it did not harm the kingdom's foundation, the kingdom would not have the time to deal with it. However, she wanted to tell Brando that the trouble lay with the person behind Grodin. Count Randner was the highest-ranking official of the Randner border region of the Kingdom of Erewhon. He was a count with special privileges in name, but in reality his power was equivalent to a marquis. Since 2 generations ago, this family had a long history of raising a private noble army in order to deal with the barbarian invasions from the borders. Today the local forces had become the only legal private army in the kingdom. Even if the royal family did not care about these barbarians, and there were other factors that restricted the autonomy of the natives, but in this chaotic world, this count's power was evident. If Brando killed his son here, it would be tantamount to a declaration of war between the two families. Even though he called himself Viscount Gastine, there was no way he could hide the truth. Moreover, the young man wanted to obtain a piece of land. The people could run, but the new territory would not be able to withstand a single blow from Count Randner's wrath. It would probably be destroyed in an instant. Amandina did not want to see the young man's efforts go down the drain, so she hoped that he would think twice before acting. On the other hand, she did not want to show even the slightest bit of fear in front of this bestial baron. which was why she spoke in such a cryptic manner. However, she firmly believed that if it was the young man in front of her, he would be able to understand her every hidden meaning. Brando snorted coldly. Judge the situation and think thrice before acting. Cabia's cracked jaw seemed to symbolize a soundless smile. The young man's sword was pointed diagonally at the ground. His gaze swept past the tall skeleton and stared at Groton coldly, as if he was looking down at a dead dog. Sensing Brando's cold killing intent, Groton became even more resolute. Perhaps it was because he was hiding behind Cabia's, but he sneered, "If you don't kill me today, Lord Viscount, I'll make sure to repay you double in the future." The Baron of Tonagel gritted his teeth as he spat out those words. He had never suffered such humiliation in his life. The nobles he invited to watch Brando make a fool out of himself had shot themselves in the foot, and the feeling of defeat made his heart burn with anger. But just as he was about to say something to further enrage Brendel, he wanted to make the youth lose his rationality and fight with Cabias until both sides were injured. But just as he was about to speak, he saw Brando raise his hand. A streak of silver light brushed past his cheek. Groton was stunned. Half of the hair on his cheek fell to the ground, and he felt a stinging pain on his cheek. To the onlookers there was a glaring wound on his cheek. He touched his cheek in a daze, and when he looked down, his palm was stained with blood. The Baron of Erewhon screamed like a pig being slaughtered. Cabias was unmoved. The tall skeleton did not need to turn around to know what Brando's attack would do. It was not Groton's guard, and it was not worth it to attack him for a small wound. Moreover, it was good to teach him a lesson, so that the arrogant noble would not understand the relationship between them. It looked at Brando again. The young man lowered his hand and said coldly, "Keep your head, I'll come back for it next time." After saying that, he glanced around the hall. His cold aura forced everyone to take a step back. The young man looked back at Amandina and Scarlet, and walked out of the hall without saying a word. As soon as he turned around, the guards and heavily armored soldiers outside the hall who had heard the news immediately separated to two sides. What a joke! Most of them just happened to witness the scene of Brendel killing more than 20 knights with a single blow. Even if they did not see it with their own eyes, they still did not understand what kind of killing god this young man was from others. As long as he did not make things difficult for their lord, they would be thankful to the heavens and would not dare to stop him. Groton was angry and anxious. He wanted to order his subordinates to stop Brando, but when he thought of Brando's cold sword, he could not help but think of it. The Baron opened his mouth, but the words were stuck in his throat. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 212. Brando did not say a word after he left Groton's castle. Even though he walked out of the castle like a king, no one dared to stop him. Even the most loyal knight of Groton only dared to hold their swords and move aside in fear. However, the youth was not happy at all. He gripped his scabbard tightly as if it was still there. The scabbard creaked from the excessive force. Yes, but he still chose to compromise. It was not that he was afraid of Madara and Groton's combined forces, but Scarlet's pleading gaze moved him. Just like how he could never become Makarov, he could never ignore Sanford and the other Grey Wolves mercenaries in the courtyard because of his anger. He understood that they were the only family and sustenance the girl had in this world. She had the right to do so. Even though he understood, he still felt suppressed and angry in his heart. Especially when even Amandina had tactfully objected to it. The youth could not help but feel a chill in his heart. He wanted to rebel against Erewhon's rotten rules, but he realized that he did not have the ability to do so, and he did not even have the support to do so. He knew that Amandina wanted him to be part of the rules. Even though she did not say it explicitly, she did not hide her true intentions. Indeed, this was a better choice for him. But was it possible? Brando never thought that there would be a day when he would give up on his own ideas. If he retreated, he would have to give up everything. Even if there was a mountain of swords and a sea of fire in front of him, he had to be at odds with Groton. Even though he knew that Madara's undead were on Count Randner's side, he had to make this choice. He had already expressed his stance, and the rest could only be left to time to prove. Brando pursed his lips and did not say a word as he crossed the castle's drawbridge. But with the breeze of the afternoon, the pungent smell of blood wafted into his nostrils. Amandina's voice rang out behind him, and he heard a cry of surprise. Brando subconsciously raised his head, but at that moment he was stunned. The familiar street in front of him seemed to stretch endlessly in his vision. The long street stretched to the end of the horizon. There was not a single person on the street, but there were rows of brand new crosses erected on the side of the street. Rows of crosses with bloody corpses hung on them. Most of the corpses were dressed in adventurers' and mercenaries' clothes. There were also some who were poor people from the outer city. There were both men and women, but all that was left were lifeless corpses. Brando remembered that during the ancient times of Wond, the local lords would hang the corpses of bandits on the crosses to warn those who continued their business. But at this moment, who was Grodin trying to warn? It wasn't just a warning to Grodin, but also to the adventurers and mercenaries in the city. Grodin wanted to use this incident to show them who was the true master of this land. A warning. Good. Brando took a deep breath and almost immediately turned around. But he clenched his teeth and endured it. But from the corner of his eyes, he saw a figure flashing by the side of the street. It's him? Brando's heart skipped a beat and immediately chased after him. He turned the corner of the street and followed him into a small alley. The familiar greenish-gray robe entered Brendel's eyes. The young lord hesitated for a moment, but the other party had already opened his mouth. Brando? Sir, am I right? The young man wearing the greenish-gray robe looked at him and asked coldly. Brando recognized him as the acolyte he had met in the morning. He had a deep impression of him and naturally wouldn't forget him. He nodded his head. The young man didn't immediately open his mouth. Both of them sank into silence. Although the young man's face was cold, his eyes were filled with silent anger. After a short moment of silence, the young man finally opened his mouth. I remember you asked me if I wanted to take revenge. The young man's expression didn't change as he replied, If I tell you now I want to. He raised his head and clenched his teeth. Sir, can you show me the way? Brando remained silent. This is also what the other people in the city think. The mercenaries and adventurers have already formed a grudge against Baron Grodin. The young man stared at him and continued, If Sir is willing, we are willing to serve you. The distance between them was less than 10 meters, but Brando shook his head. I still have the same question. Do you want to take revenge? The young man was startled. He hesitated for a moment before nodding his head. Then live well, Brando looked at him and replied, I promise you, but not now. Sir? Brando didn't say anything else. He turned around and walked out of the alley, just in time to see the others chasing after him. But when they saw the young man's gloomy face and the endless anger he was suppressing, the Nightsong Tiger and Sanford, who didn't know the truth, could only look at each other. The young man passed by them. Brando. Romaine was the only one who called out to him. Roman stood behind him with her small bag in her hands. She looked at him with her dark brown eyes and raised her eyebrows. Are you angry? Brando was slightly startled. He didn't want to say anything, but he couldn't bring himself to be angry when he looked at Romaine's face. He could only sigh and gently pat the girl's cheek. Thank you. Roman frowned and pushed his hand away. She asked curiously, but I haven't said anything yet. Didn't Amandina ask you to come here? How did you know? Brando sighed again and shook his head. He turned his head to the other side and sure enough, he saw the noble girl lifting her skirt to catch up with him. Are you angry with me? Amandina raised her head to look at him and whispered, My lord? You didn't do anything wrong, Amandina. Brando replied in a low voice. But you're still angry, my lord? Yes. What? Amandina, you know that things in this world aren't as simple as black and white. You're right. Let Count Randner be the highest-ranking officer in Aween's southern borders. His influence is so great that it can be said that he's a vassal. His private army can make anyone who dares to oppose him tremble in fear. Even those who are truly powerful can only curse him in secret. Not to mention the ants in our line of work. Brando shook his head and looked at Amandina. It can even be said that if he sneezes, our path ahead will be filled with dangers and thorns. If we're not careful, we'll be reduced to ashes. But? Amandina asked seriously. But, Brando nodded, these are not reasons for me to bow down to him. If accepting Grodin's gift with a fake smile is considered shrewd, then I'd rather choose the path of iron and blood, fire and sword. Do you understand? You've asked me why before, Amandina, but I don't know what you're talking about, he said with a flick of his finger. The answer is simple. There's no reason, it's because I'm Brando. He turned to look at the young Roman. You're Brando from Bucci. Amandina immediately winked at him playfully. It was as if their minds were connected. Amandina was slightly speechless. She was stunned for a moment before she reacted. But perhaps we can choose a more sensible way. I can understand your thoughts, my lord, but there's a saying among nobles. The dead have no right to object. Right now we're not only facing Baron Grodin, but also the Randner family and Madara. My lord Amandina bit her lips. Even though she felt something ignited in her chest because of Brando's words, her dark eyes were still filled with worry. That's my problem, Amandina, Brando replied calmly, whether it's Grodin, Count Randner, or even Madara's undead army. He looked at Grodin's towering castle again. Since we'll have to face them sooner or later, then I'll be waiting for you. He left these words behind and turned to leave. The red-haired girl with a long ponytail who was far behind the group saw this scene. She looked at Brando's back and tightened her grip on her spear. Amandina also looked at the young man's back worriedly, a hint of admiration flashing in her eyes. But it was precisely because of this that she was even more worried that this outstanding young man would do something impulsive. After all, their current strength was far from enough to contend against Grodin. Sometimes, confidence was not enough to solve everything. Clang. A white porcelain ornament from the Anson era was smashed into pieces. Not long after Brando and the rest left, Grodin angrily smashed something in his study. There were only 3 people left in the room. Cabias and Rothko had retreated. As undead, they naturally could not stay in the castle for long. The secret alliance with Madara was not a small matter. Of course, the consequences of revealing it to the public would not affect Count Randner at all. However, the reputation of colluding with the undead would not be good if word got out. Right now, Grodin was only left with his 2 male pets, which was why he could vent his anger without any qualms. Viscount Gaston, these northerners have gone too far. The Baron was in a state of hysteria. He had never been humiliated like this in his entire life. If not for the fact that the other party was too strong, he would have definitely taken their heads. Even if it meant going to war with another family, he would not hesitate to do so. Even though it would be difficult to explain to Count Randner, Grodin did not have the time to care about such details in his rage. Seeing him take 2 deep breaths, one of the male pets finally dared to approach him and whispered, "My lord, they have already left the castle. Why don't we just... P.S. I've been depressed for the past few days and it's hard for me to write. I've been in seclusion for a few days and I've finally cleared my mind today. I've broken through the barrier of the strong, and everything is clear before my eyes. I hope all the eunuch haters can scram now." Chapter 213. My lord, they've already left the castle. Why don't we? Even though he's a viscount, his family shouldn't be able to reach so far south. If I remember correctly, he's from Balta, the northernmost border of the kingdom. Idiot. Grodin was furious, but his mind was still clear. He couldn't help but curse. He snorted coldly and said, "Who should we send? That guy is at least a gold-ranked fighter. Didn't you hear what that skeleton said? The red-haired woman beside him is probably at the same level as well. Do you think I don't have enough trouble? My lord, it's my fault for not thinking things through. Then why don't we just seal the city gates and leave them here?" Another male pet cautiously approached him and asked. Grodin took a deep breath and kicked the bastard away. "Do you have a pig's brain? Who's going to seal them off?" He scolded. "Why don't I send you instead?" The male pet cried out in pain, but quickly got up and shook his head with a pale face. Even though he did not know the strength of a gold-ranked fighter, he knew that he would only be courting death if he went. "Then let's ask those skeletons to do it. Didn't they sign an alliance with us?" Grodin's male pet glanced at his companion with a gloating expression, and replied in an even more submissive manner. But Grodin shook his head coldly and said with disdain, "They won't do it. They would not do anything. Madara had just signed a peace treaty with Awin, and they would not offend another noble family at this time. Even though I don't know why their commander is here, I don't think he'll be willing to leave anytime soon." There was something he did not say out loud. In reality, both sides were just using each other. Signing this secret alliance meant that there would not be any communication on the surface, but Count Randner could use the Madara army to suppress the kingdom's southern army and further consolidate his power. This was the true meaning of this alliance. Of course, there was no need to say these words to a male pet. He turned his neck and touched the wound on his cheek. He replied with some hatred, "But this matter won't be settled so easily. I'll definitely teach that guy a lesson. Father might not agree to go to war with another family, but I'll see if he can protect the people around Viscount Gaston." He sneered and immediately said, "Bring me a pen and paper. I will write a letter to the Count immediately." "Yes, my lord." The male pet beside him immediately lowered his head and was about to do as he was told. But it was at this moment that the door of the study silently opened. A figure slid in like a shadow, then said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, but I'm sorry. "My lord, the matter with Kyrie has been settled. I just received a messenger pigeon." Groudon paused for a moment before he recalled the matter. He immediately nodded and gritted his teeth as he said, "That's good. Give that thing and the letter to my father. I'm sure he won't refuse my small request." Groudon turned around and saw that the figure was still standing there motionlessly. "Is there anything else?" he asked. "My lord, the city seems to be a little unstable. I'm worried about the mercenaries." The figure replied in a low voice. "Don't worry about them. Even though the skeletons of Madara won't help me deal with that damn Viscount, they won't let them off easily. But they won't let the rioters do anything to me. I know that better than you." Groudon waved his hand. "You may leave. If those mercenaries don't know their place, I'll teach them to be obedient." The silhouette nodded and then silently retreated. On the other hand, even though Amandina wanted to let the rest of the day pass by peacefully, it seemed like there were some things in this world that could not be changed by one's will. She never thought that things would develop out of her expectations from the start. They could not stay in Abyss any longer after the conflict with the local lord. Brando was not afraid of Groudon's revenge, but he had to consider the possibility of Madara stabbing him in the back. After all, they had fought once in Fortress Redan and were targeted by Madara and Brags. He might even be on Incersta's assassination list. Cabias might be wary of his identity as Viscount Gaston, but it was just a facade. He could hide it for a while, but it could not hide it forever. Leaving Tonajul as soon as possible was the wisest choice. However, 3 hours after they left the city, they ran into a group of Groudon's cavalry. "Carrie?" Spiderhammer was equally surprised. Spiderhammer, who had a ferocious face like a hyena, was surprised by his good luck. He looked greedily at the women in the group. Oh, Martha, he had never seen such outstanding women in this area. Even if there were only a few of them in the territory, they were still the Lord's women. He did not dare to have any improper thoughts. The rest of the women were either thin and sallow commoners or prostitutes who frequented inns. He had never seen someone with such an outstanding temperament and beauty before. Kyrie couldn't help but rub his eyes, thinking that he was dreaming. He could not help but think about what kind of benefits he would get if he gave these women to the Lord. Of course, it was not impossible for him to secretly keep one of them. He secretly licked his lips and glanced at the group of people blocking the road. They were just a group of mercenaries. It was not his first time dealing with these people. His lord's last woman was the little sister of a small mercenary group leader. Wasn't he the one who taught those people a lesson? Carrie secretly counted the number of people in the group. There were only a dozen of them. Even though they were only at the mid-level of Iron ranked, they were a little difficult to deal with. However, they were not even worth mentioning in front of 100 of his men. Carrie could not help but think that this was a gift from the heavens. His hand was already on the handle of his mace, and his gaze finally stopped at the young man leading the group. A young man? He looks like a noble. A noble's son on a trip. Carrie secretly confirmed his identity. This kind of person was not uncommon in Wonde, but to be so determined to travel to a barren place like Tonajul, one must be naive. Did he really think that he could run around as he pleased just because he was a noble? The cavalry captain could not help but smirk as he licked his lips and asked, "Who are you people?" His hand was still on his weapon and his voice was like a broken bellows, leaving a deep impression. "Don't you know where this place is? So many people are carrying weapons in violation of the ban, could it be?" He wanted to say, "bandits roaming the wilderness," but he could not finish his sentence because he saw the young man looking at him strangely, as if he was looking at an idiot. "Did you come from the Green Village?" Brando asked as if he did not hear the question. Carrie was startled, but he immediately reacted. "Bastard, who do you think you are talking to? Do you know who we are? We are Lord Groudon's cavalry. I suspect that you are a group of bandits roaming the wilderness. Throw away your weapons and surrender," he shouted fiercely, "otherwise when I give the order, you won't have time to regret it." "So?" Brando asked. "So what?" Carrie did not hear the suppressed killing intent in Brando's voice, or rather, he did not think that a group of iron-ranked mercenaries would dare to resist him. There were more than 100 cavalrymen behind him, and they were not just for show. They were bloodthirsty men who were selected from the mercenaries for a large sum of money. "But I'll give you a chance to turn over a new leaf." The cavalry captain waved his left hand at the mercenaries. "The women stay and the rest of you get lost." Amandina, who was standing behind him, did not feel the slightest bit of anger when she heard his words. On the contrary, she was used to the arrogance of the noble's private soldiers. She sighed. Can't he see that he's walking into a trap? Amandina could not help but look at Brando. The anger that the youth had been suppressing since he left the Baron's castle finally erupted. His right hand loosened from the scabbard and drooped down. He tilted his head and said word by word, "I remember you asked me who I am, right?" Carrie was startled again. Is there something wrong with his head? However, this noble knight captain who had been through hundreds of battles still subconsciously tightened his grip on the hammer in his hand. For some reason he felt that something was not quite right. "Mr. Cavalryman, I wonder if you have heard of a story?" "A story?" "A story about being brainless and unhappy." This time it was not just Carrie, even Amandina and the Nightsong Tiger were startled. There were only a few famous bedtime stories in Wonde, but they had never heard of a story about being brainless and unhappy. What kind of name is that? While they were surprised, Carrie felt like his lungs were about to explode from anger. He subconsciously thought that he was being played and could not help but reply fiercely, "I'm sorry, I've never heard of this story and I'm not interested in these children's stories." He gritted his teeth and said, "Don't try to stall for time, I'll count to 3 and this is your last chance." He turned his horse around and shouted, "1." But Brando shook his head, "There's no need to count." He raised his head and said, "What I want to say is, my name is Unhappy." He raised his hand and everyone only saw a flash of a figure, followed by the crisp sound of bones breaking. The cavalry captain who had his neck broken maintained his shocked expression for the last moment, and fell off his horse with a bang. "P.S. I'm also very unhappy in the face of a brainless person. If I'm unhappy my thoughts won't be clear. If I'm some kind of troll, not only will I not read the original version, I won't even read the pirated posts. I'll be trolling while reading and I'll be proud to accept it." Chapter 214. The battle ended very quickly. Indeed, the Nightsong Tiger, Sanford, and the rest were on par with the ferocious cavalry. However, the noble cavalry captain who had lost his life at the start of the battle did not expect that there were 2 gold rankers among this group of ordinary people. The Oracle of Thunder, Scarlet, and Brando, who had just reached the edge of the elemental barrier and entered the gold rank. The 2 of them were like 2 silver and red flames bursting out from the ground. They shot forward in an instant and passed through the entire cavalry. Looking from above, it looked like an electric dragon and an ice dragon traversing the north and south. The dead were lying on the ground. At that moment the cavalry collapsed. Before the battle even started, they had already scattered and fled in all directions. Unfortunately, the speed of the war horses was only enough to bully ordinary people. It did not give them any advantage in escaping. In just half an hour, the only thing left on the plains were the corpses of the cavalry and the horses. This was the result of Brando not summoning the elven princess and the cards that he bought. Otherwise, the whole process would not have taken so long. Medisha was also a gold ranker, and she was also a cavalry. Coupled with the unicorn's speed, which was 10 times faster than the war horses, she would probably be able to slaughter all the scum in a few rounds. But that was not important. After the battle, Brando finally calmed down. He sat on the corpse of a warhorse and looked at the others who were cleaning up the battlefield. At the same time he finally had the time to check his own condition. In Baron Grodin's castle, he broke through unexpectedly due to his anger and entered the ranks of gold rankers. But until now he had not checked his condition. Ever since he came to this world he always thought that his unique advantage was that he could level up through experience. The process of activating his elemental barrier could be completed by completing a few simple quests. Thus, the most difficult problem for NPCs was not a problem for players. However, after the battle with Brando's grandfather in the dream, he had always suspected that his elemental barrier could be improved through training. This was supposed to be the privilege of NPCs. Suspicions were just suspicions because he had never experienced anything similar after that. Moreover, the growth in his swordsmanship could be explained as him inheriting and digesting Brando's original memories. If he saw it as a mission reward, everything would make sense. However, it wasn't until today that he finally realized that he seemed to possess some of the characteristics of an NPC. For example, he could increase the level of his skills through training, or he could similarly rely on breaking through realms to increase his power. Just like before. Although this was better than nothing to him, it was still a piece of good news. Moreover, this also proved another thing, which was that he did indeed possess the characteristics of both a player and an NPC. It was as if the mixed identities of Sophie and Brando were supposed to be there. He calmed down and brought up his status menu one by one. Brando was immediately shocked. He found that his actual level had not increased at all. He was still at level 32, but he found that all his attributes had increased by more than 30%. What's going on? He immediately closed the menu and the green shadow on his retina changed. When the young man glanced at it, he almost spat out a mouthful of water. He saw a small bracket next to his name on the status menu. Brando Elite Template. Damn, Lord Martha, can you not be so careless? Is it possible that every time a bot breaks through realms the bot's level will increase by 1? Then the next time it will be Rare Template? Then Lord Template? Then Elite Lord Template? Seeing this scene, even with Brando's current state of mind, he could not help but secretly curse. For a moment he almost thought that he was a monster. It was just like in the games and novels he used to read before he transmigrated to this world. There were often cliché plots where a certain boss mutated and became a mutated boss. However, he did not expect that there would be a day where such a plot would actually happen to him. Moreover, it actually happened to himself. Brando could not help but cough, and then subconsciously looked left and right. He was worried that there would be 25 or 40 footmen jumping out to raid him or something. Although it was a little unrealistic no matter how he thought about it, what happened now was unrealistic enough. Compared to this, it seemed that everything else that happened was not so inconceivable. But wait, after a short moment of astonishment, Brando reacted. With his understanding of the game, since he had the elite template, then the changes in his attributes should not only be reflected in the numerical values. What about the elite skills? Additional resistance? Brando immediately switched down the menu, and found 3 new slots under the character skills column. Above it was written in dark green text, Elite Skills, Additional Resistance. However, these fields were still locked at the moment, and there were some similar numbers behind them, 45, 47, 60. Brando only hesitated for a moment before he understood what these things meant. Level lock. This thing was the same as the additional element column after elemental activation. Presumably, it could only be unlocked after reaching the corresponding level. It was just that the latter, in addition to reaching the corresponding level, also required the investment of element points. The elite individual skills were the same as the general low-level combat skills, and the additional resistance was at most equivalent to adding an additional cloak equipment slot. However, if this mutation continued and went further to the level of a boss, an elite boss, or even a world leader, then it would be completely different. Brando pursed his lips and his heart moved slightly. The skills of a boss had already reached the intermediate level, the skills of an elite boss were even higher level, and the world leader had already surpassed the players. This was the only way to obtain top-level skills. Although it was obvious that breaking through to the next level must follow the general rules of NPCs, which was that the higher the level, the lower the probability. It was also because of this that the number of NPCs who had elemental activation or even entered the gold stage was less than 1 in 10. It was also because of this that the number of strong people in this world was distributed in such a clear pyramid pattern. Otherwise, it would not have become the world of players in the middle and later stages of the game. But in any case, it was always good to have a possibility, even if it was as illusory as the clouds in the sky. Brando quickly calmed down from the special situation because he had something more important to check: elemental activation. He opened the panel and sure enough he saw these 2 words behind the elemental activation column. Stability, stillness. This was not his elemental activation, but the nature of the elemental power he sensed. As his power grew further, the rhetoric to describe this elemental power would become more and more accurate. And once he broke through that barrier at that moment, the power of the law that truly belonged to him would descend upon him. It was not until then that he could truly be said to have the qualifications to flexibly use the elemental power. In terms of element points, law skills, and domains, a warrior who had elemental activation could indeed be said to be an inhuman existence. But this was also the reason why it was so difficult to elemental activation in the Amber Sword. Not only elemental activation, even the qualifications to enter the gold stage were enough to make most people flinch. In fact, this was a well-known rule in the Amber Sword because there were 2 conditions for ordinary people to enter the gold stage: absolute power to break through the 100 power level, and the second was to be able to sense the elemental power. The first of these 2 conditions was not difficult for most people with a certain level of talent, but these people would eventually stop at the peak of silver. The reason was simple: they could not sense the elemental power. The elemental power was the law of the world, and if one could not see the line that manipulated the law on the other side of the world, then no matter how strong a person was, he would never have the opportunity to touch the wall of elemental power. In comparison, wizards, priests, and even knights were far more likely to touch the law of the line than warriors, so the latter's ratio of NPCs in the game was even less than 1 in 10,000. Brando knew a few warriors who had elemental activation, and only a few people like Buga were strange. The rest, most of them were knights. And people like him who had the opportunity to have an epiphany was even rarer. Based on this point alone, his luck was truly unparalleled. But what really confused him was the description of the nature of the elemental power. If his elemental power was ice or cold or even north wind or water, or even a higher level of heat, he probably would not be so confused, because the external form of his elemental power was clearly the secondary elemental power of cold and ice, but the description of the elemental power was static and stable. No matter how he looked at it, it was the description of space or time. Brando could not help but look at his hand, and for a moment he was a little confused. Was it ice or space? The difference between the two was not small. Although ice was one of the 4 greater elemental powers. But space and time were the legendary existences. The young man shook his head, and then he looked up, but saw Amandina and the Roman walking over together. He was slightly startled because he saw the 2 girls holding hands, and a somewhat timid little girl looking at him. A little girl with long green hair, at most 8 or 9 years old. The Senia. Brando frowned slightly. The only village in the south was the green village at the border of Tanajil. If he remembered correctly, there was a group of Senia living there. According to legends, the Senia were the descendants of the children of the forest. These short humans were close relatives to the druids of the forest. They had a certain degree of wildness, but because of this they were always regarded as barbarians. The Senia were extremely isolated. They hid at the edge of the forest, and were unwilling to assimilate with Erewhon. The local nobles usually took a passive attitude towards these so-called inferior races, but there were a few who used bloody methods to suppress them. It seemed that Grodin was one of them. But why did he capture a Senia girl? The nobles disdained to come into contact with these barbarians. Even if they were touched, it would be considered a great humiliation. Even the commoners did not think highly of these barbarians. The young man subconsciously touched his chin. But the green village was his destination. P.S. Today's final chapter. Thank you. Thank you for your suggestions and help. My thoughts were all closely related to you. Thank you for your suggestions and encouragement. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 215. The little girl's eyes were like emeralds covered in dust, hiding a deep, soul-stirring green that radiated with the power of life. Her slender, seemingly malnourished hands were holding Amandina's and the Roman's hands respectively. She was wearing a gray linen dress, and her white knees were bare as she stood on the ground. She bit her lips as she looked at him. Brando was slightly startled. In his eyes, the long green hair that flowed like a waterfall was like a newly grown vine. Her face was covered in dust, and it was filled with a weak and timid aura. But the little girl did not avert her gaze, and only looked at him cautiously. This is? In the entire world of Vaunt, apart from the forest elves, only the pure-blooded Senia had emerald eyes. They were the children of the tree. However, the green hair that cascaded down to her waist like a waterfall was so dazzling that the young man almost thought that she was an infant oracle of God. In the Amber Sword he had only seen one NPC with such pure green hair. It was the Angel of the Tree. Scarlet took it from the cavalry or perhaps from a nearby village. Amandina answered. She lowered her head and carefully combed the hair in front of the little girl's forehead. Brando looked up. She's a Senia, did you know? What's that, Brando? The Roman held the little girl's hand and blinked as he asked. A Senia? Amandina's hands subconsciously retracted, but she hesitated for a moment before she finished what she was doing. The little girl was startled and looked at her with her emerald green eyes. Amandina's gaze was a little complicated. There were rumors about these green people, in many places. One of the most widely spread rumors was that these Senia carried the disease of the beastmen. Most people did not want to come into contact with these savages in the forest, let alone nobles. In extreme areas, people even supported burning these heretics to prevent the spread of the beastmen disease. But Brando lowered his head and softened his tone, just like the Wone people who were used to comforting children. Then he looked at the little girl and asked, "What's your name?" To the young people, the Senians were no different from the people of Erewhon and Cruz. 7 or 8 centuries ago, during the war against the Dark Dragon, the Senia had hidden themselves in the vast forests of the south and sealed themselves off for hundreds of years. Their backwardness was seen as their own fault, but to Brando this period of history was more like an abstract symbol described in the background. The little girl looked at him and opened her mouth slightly. She doesn't speak Cruz. Amandina replied. Brando wasn't surprised. He nodded and straightened up. It's okay. I roughly know where she came from. But I'm a little curious. Amandina nodded lightly to show that she understood his curiosity. Ever since she knew that the little girl was a Sinian, she wanted to know why the nobles were so kind as to not execute her. Not to mention a barbaric place like Tanajul, even in the hinterlands of the kingdom, it was within the law to execute a Sinian. Brando stood up and looked around. We'll send her to the Green Village. Green Village? Yes. Where is that? A Sinian village. Brando looked around and picked up a cavalry sword from the ground. He weighed it in his hand and sheathed it. It's just south of here, about half a day's journey. A Sinian village? Why are we going there? Amandina frowned and whispered, Find someone to send this little girl back. My lord, the Sinians? She wanted to say something, but Brando waved his hand at her. My lord. Amandina frowned and objected, That's the Sinians we're talking about. If outsiders know that we've dealt with them, it won't be good for my lord. My lord, your reputation? Amandina frowned slightly and suddenly remembered that the little girl was still by her side. Even though she knew that Brendel might not understand her words, she still subconsciously shut her mouth. There's no need, Amandina, Brando interrupted her and replied, But that's our destination. What? Amandina was stunned. Brendel nodded. To find Valhalla, not only did he have to go to the Green Village, he also had to rely on the Sinians' help. Mother Marcia had done him a huge favor by sending this little girl to him. Even though the Senia people were closed-minded, they had a kind of simple feelings for their true friends just like the mountain people. He had to use the Senians to contact the Druids in the forest. Druids? Brando thought to himself. Druids. They're a race similar to the Silver Elves, maybe even earlier. They disappeared from the civilized world after the Year of Prosperity, 350 years ago. Brando, what are the Senians? The Roman grabbed the little girl's hand and blinked when she saw that her question was not answered. It's a long story. Brando smiled and raised his hand to scratch her nose, causing Amandina to frown and take a few steps back. Brendel finally answered, But the elves have a name for them. At Zon. Brando said, Children of the forest. Werewolves? Amandina's eyes widened in curiosity. I've heard of them. Brendel lowered his head. He noticed that when he mentioned the word, at Zon, the little girl had a clear reaction. She raised her head and looked at him with a pair of emerald eyes. In her eyes there was a deep green color. The Green Village that Brendel mentioned was an unfamiliar name to most of the people in Aween and the people who made the maps. In the latest administrative map of the Year of the Candle and Dagger, there were as many as 450 towns, villages and manors in the kingdom, but none of them were named Green Village. But Brendel knew this place. It was a settlement of the Senians at the border. In fact, in the Year of Silver, which was about 10 years later, the adventure group that set out to the Kalanga Mountains had set out from here. But the scenery at that time was different from now. They rode through the cultivated land that the Senians had opened up at the edge of the forest. They saw the fields spread out in strips along the forest. The faint sunlight passed through the tall black pine trees and fell on the artificial crops. It was so quiet that it felt like an empty dream. In Brando's memory, there was a meadow that stretched far into the distance. Other than the path under the horses' hooves that was still stubbornly growing out of the forest, all traces of artificial crops had been buried under the traces of time. He looked past the fields and could almost see the river bank behind them. He remembered that it was a settlement of level 30 creeping demons. It took a lot of effort for them to pass through the dark forest. However, the damage caused by the attack of the noble cavalry pulled him back to reality. The first thing he saw was a broken fence, war horses passing through the fields and crops being knocked askew. It was as if a herd of wild boars had crossed the border. Those bastards. One of the Grey Wolves mercenaries cursed in a low voice. Mercenaries like them were mostly born in the mountains. They were either hunters in the mountains or farmers in this line of work. Of course, the noble did not understand that these crops were everything to the people who relied on them for a living. As if to answer his words, they went around the fence and saw a woman in a tattered linen shirt kneeling on the ground. She covered her face and sobbed softly in front of a destroyed field. A man, who seemed to be her husband, was holding a rake and looking at the scene with a frown. When he saw the group coming out from behind the fence, he was stunned for a moment. Then his expression changed. He held the rake in front of his chest and shouted, "Asha, run! They're back!" After that, he let out a low growl and lunged forward. But before he could do anything, Scarlet, who was riding on her horse, swept him with her halberd and sent him tumbling. The red-haired girl frowned. She did not expect the man to be so weak. She then realized that the man was probably just an ordinary farmer. She dismounted from her horse and tried to help him up. However, before she could make a move, she felt herself being hugged by someone else. The woman called Asha hugged her from behind. She cried and shook her head, "Please don't kill him. Joel, run." The man did not intend to do so. His eyes turned red when he saw his wife hugging Scarlet. He growled and charged forward again. His growl was close to that of a wild beast. However, he immediately felt a sharp spear pressed against his throat. He looked along the spear and saw the red-haired girl's cold amber eyes. He subconsciously froze and couldn't help but shiver. His entire body froze involuntarily. "Idiot," Scarlet said coldly. "You overestimate yourself." She put down her halberd and swung it to the side. With a flash of lightning, a tall black pine tree fell to the ground. Throughout the entire process, the people on the horses did not move at all, as if they were spectators. Even the mercenaries did not have a good impression of the Senia people. Only Roman blinked his eyes, full of curiosity from beginning to end. The man seemed to have just woken up. He did not understand why Scarlet did not kill him. His legs went weak and he almost fell to the ground. But it was at this moment that a small voice came from the crowd. "Is Joel? Elvish, Uncle Joel?" The man called Joel was stunned. He couldn't believe his ears. He turned around and looked at the little girl with long green hair in Roman's arms in disbelief. For a moment he thought he was hallucinating. "Sifrid, are you here? Didn't they?" The woman behind Scarlet let go of her hand and asked in a daze. "Is Joel Essa voiced him? In Elvish, Uncle Joel, they saved me." The little girl replied softly, word by word. Her voice was as ethereal as a breeze passing through the forest, causing the wind chimes to ring. "P.S. I had something to do yesterday, so I was delayed. I didn't even get to send you a notice. Sorry." Chapter 216. The corpses of the deceased were laid out in the middle of the village square in front of the statue of the goddess of the forest, Naya. The square was silent as the elderly shaman prayed for the souls of the deceased. The men and women watched the scene in silence. Ever since centuries ago, suffering had become a part of life for the Senia people. Because they were powerless to resist, they could only choose to hide further into the forest. But life in the dark forest was not necessarily sweet. Cold, hunger, and the constant attacks of monsters brought about the shadow of death. Everyone looked at the oldest among them, their elder. To the Senia people, being the oldest meant having a wealth of experience as well as being a natural leader. In times of hardship, the elder was always able to lead the people out of their predicament. But this time, even the wise elder's eyebrows drooped as if he was powerless. The old man gripped his walking stick tightly. Every wrinkle on his face seemed to be written with a heavy shadow. He sighed, and a dark-skinned middle-aged man with a short beard gritted his teeth and turned around to leave. "Uncle Bolton, where are you going?" A tall youth beside the old man called out to him. The middle-aged man stopped and answered without turning his head, "I'm going to snatch Sifrid back." "Calm down," the youth persuaded. "Uncle Bolton, what can you do by yourself? Are you going to throw your life away?" "I promise, Sally. Even if I'm going to throw my life away, I'm going," the middle-aged man stubbornly replied. But he also understood that it was only said out of anger. He could not help but turn around and clench his fists. Every muscle in his body was stretched taut. "Bolton, calm down." The old man with the walking stick finally spoke. He sighed, "Sally is my daughter. Sifrid is also my granddaughter. Once winter is over, we'll return to the forest." The middle-aged man turned around and looked at everyone with bloodshot eyes. "Then what about Sifrid and the others? Are we not going to avenge them?" Everyone fell silent and lowered their heads. The middle-aged man snorted coldly and turned around to leave. The old man sighed again as he looked at the middle-aged man's back. He knew that the middle-aged man would not really go out and cause trouble for the noble knight. Every man in the tribe would not easily abandon the tribe. This was their responsibility. However, no matter what, Bolton's departure still made the crowd go silent. But what could they do? The strongest person in the village was the silver-ranked martial arts master. It was impossible for him to be a match for the terrifying Baron. However, the silence did not last for long. The ceremony had to continue. But at this moment, everyone saw a figure stumbling into the village. It was Joel, who was on guard duty outside the village. Everyone recognized the familiar figure. They couldn't help but feel nervous. Could it be that the vicious aristocratic knight had returned? But didn't they already take Siffred away? What's wrong, Joel? The old man was slightly taken aback, but he immediately asked. As the leader of this group of people, although he maintained a deliberate calm on the surface, his hands were actually tightly gripping the wooden staff in his hand. Siffred. Siffred. Joel gasped for breath as he finally reached them. It was as if he had seen a ghost. Siffred? The old man froze for a moment before his expression changed. What's wrong with her? Siffred was rescued. What? The news that the little girl had been rescued quickly spread throughout the village in the remote forest. But Brando was a little embarrassed by his current situation. He did not expect that his group would receive such a cold reception. Even though I've never expected gratitude from anyone for anything, I'm still the one who brought Siffred back to the village. However, none of them had expected that the gratitude they received was far less than the suspicion and fear they received in their eyes. As they rode through the village on horseback, they could feel the similar gazes everywhere. The middle-aged man called Joel was the first to receive them. He led them to the largest house in the village and told them that the elder would be arriving soon. In the end, he gave them a fearful and complicated look before he closed the door and left. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were the first to lose their patience. TSK, what kind of attitude is that? That's right, we shouldn't have come here. Another person said. However, they also knew that it was just empty talk because the young overlord had made it very clear that this was their destination. But they did not know why they had to come to such a remote place. They could not help but look at Brando in confusion. Brando could only smile bitterly. Amandina was also looking at him with a gloomy gaze. Less prejudice will make you feel more at ease. The young man had no choice but to answer. But they did escape during the war, my lord. The younger wild elf sister could not help but ask in a clear voice. She had been following Brando for a while now because she found that the young lord seemed to have the ability to deal with her endless questions. Even her sister could not do it. She could not help but ask questions even though she had been scolded by her sister many times in private. But just like now, she could not help but ask. Tia. The older wild elf sister gritted her teeth. She could not wait to strangle her beloved sister to death. She was always causing trouble for her. Then she raised her head and looked at Brando carefully. Fortunately, the young man did not have the intention to make a fuss. Amandina shook her head. I don't care about this, my lord, but... Yes, I know. Reputation. Brando nodded. My lord, since you know... But Brando shook his head again. But you also know that I don't care about this. My lord. Brando shook his head. But at this time there was a sudden knock on the door. Everyone was startled. Immediately, a mercenary with one hand on his weapon carefully walked over to open the door. The door opened, but there was no one outside. My lord? The mercenary who opened the door was slightly startled. What's wrong? The mercenary moved aside with a strange expression, revealing a basket of berries outside the door. These fruits were obviously freshly picked from the forest. There were even dew and leaves left on them from the forest in the morning. Everyone was stunned, and then they looked at each other in silence. Brando sighed in his heart. Even though there was still suspicion on his face, there was also gratitude. But the misunderstanding between the Erwin and the Senia was too deep. It was so deep that it was ingrained in their hearts. What should we do, my lord? Sir Lord? The mercenary asked. Put it away. Brando replied. Even so, he could not help but look beyond the door and stop at the square outside. The current green village was indeed very different from his memories. The village that existed in his memories was overgrown with weeds and broken walls. Even though it had just experienced a terrible attack, there were traces of fighting and bloodstains everywhere. But at least it still had the scent of a human. He looked at the tall wooden statue of Nia in the middle of the village. The Senia's deity was carved in a lifelike manner. The heroic goddess of the forest wore a fur robe and carried a short bow. She raised a basket full of prey and fruits with both hands. In the culture of the mountain people, she symbolized the harvest of the hunt and the harvest of the crops. His gaze shifted to the other side. In fact, the Senia still lived in conical huts made of stone and wood, and not in tents like the legend said. It was just that their culture had long been lost in the vast forest. The legendary Night Walker of the Senia was only a legend now. But their relationship with the Druids was still as close as it was a few centuries ago. When he thought of this, the mercenary had already closed the door. Even the mountain people who looked down on the Senia and the Grey Wolves mercenaries could not help but fall silent and reconsider the relationship between the Senia and the Senia. But this situation did not last long because there was another knock on the door. But this time it was not fresh fruits but the person Brando had been waiting for. An old man with a wooden staff in his hand. The youth immediately recognized him as an elder of the village, and he knew the customs of the Senia like the back of his hand. On the other side was a dark-skinned middle-aged man with Sifrid leaning against him. He must be the little girl's father. Guess from the outside, thank you very much. Brendel did not have time to react, but the old man had already bowed deeply to them. The youth frowned slightly and replied, "There's no need for that, it's just a matter of convenience." He paused for a moment and went straight to the point. "Besides, I also have a matter that I need your help with." The old man and the middle-aged man beside him looked at each other and nodded. "Joel has already informed us of your request. It's not a problem for us." When Brendel heard this, he raised his head and looked at him. He knew that the old man was lying. It was dangerous to enter the dark forest at any time. Even a group of mercenaries like them had to be fully prepared. For ordinary people like them to enter the forest, especially in the depths of the forest, it was no different from sending them to their deaths. However, this Senia elder was lying. "Who are you going to send?" Brendel raised an eyebrow and asked. "I'll go." The middle-aged man glanced at his daughter, then looked at them and answered resolutely. "Pizos? Elvin, Daddy?" The little girl immediately raised her head and asked in surprise. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 217. Pizos? Elvin, Daddy? The little girl immediately raised her head and asked in surprise. "What about your daughter?" Brando frowned. "I will take care of her. Sifrid's mother is my adopted daughter." The elder paused for a moment before he answered, "Don't worry, my lord. Besides, Bolton came willingly. He is very grateful that you brought Sifrid back." He paused for a moment and stroked Sifrid's hair. "Of course, if I didn't have to stay behind to lead everyone, I would rather be your guide, my lord. Compared to Bolton, I am more familiar with this forest. I hope my lord can understand." Everyone fell silent. As mercenaries, their knowledge of the dark forest was no less than Brando's. There were even more terrifying legends about this place than the most terrifying bedtime stories in Aween that were used to scare children. "What about her mother?" Amandina was the only one who asked with a frown. Brando's heart skipped a beat when he saw the little girl's grip on her father's clothes. The elder sighed and replied with a hint of reminiscence, "Sifrid's mother is half elven. She used to be the most beautiful girl in our village. She was also the happiest girl when she married Bolton. Unfortunately, in the last hunt, she had to protect the others." Brando gritted his teeth. Of course he knew what a hunt was. In most areas of Wond, the nobles regarded the conquest of the barbarians as a hunt. This was a custom that had been agreed upon for centuries. However, this event had already become a symbolic act in most places, because the real barbarian invasion had completely disappeared after the First Holy War. In fact, it was rare to see the most ferocious enemies of civilization in the present day except in Tungoya. The so-called barbarians were nothing more than a misunderstanding created by Grodin and the others to satisfy their perverted desires. However, this misunderstanding was not only limited to the nobles, but also to the commoners. "All right." Brando nodded in the end. "Let's get back to the topic. Of course I won't object to it. However, this isn't a trivial matter. How much time do you need to prepare?" He glanced at Bolton, thinking that he should be able to guarantee Bolton's life with his own ability. After all, there were 3 gold-tier players in his team. They were different from other adventurer teams. In comparison, he was actually more worried about the people outside. However, the Senia elder nodded. "Sir, there's no need to worry about the other problems. But I have to remind you that perhaps you aren't too familiar with the dark forest behind us. In fact, after autumn, the forest becomes extremely dangerous. Especially when winter is approaching, animals will become more aggressive due to hunger, not to mention monsters. In fact, I suggest—" "It's okay," Brando interrupted him. "As long as you get us through the forest, we'll be fine. We just want to get through the forest. As for the rest, we can take care of it." The old man was startled and opened his mouth, but no words came out. He obviously didn't know that Brando was looking for the druids of the forest. The druids had been in seclusion for almost 400 years and had almost no contact with the outside world. However, the young man was familiar with the habits of those who had a strong sense of territory. He believed that as soon as they entered the forest, they would attract the wild beasts. With Brendel's experience, he believed that it would not be too troublesome to reverse the process and find them. As for how to convince the druids to bring him to the legendary lost temple of Valhalla, that was another problem altogether. However, Brando had already made up his mind to change his original plan. He wanted to find the legendary lost kingdom first before meeting up with the Nightsong Tiger. The reason why he did this was because of a series of problems that he had encountered recently. The number of enemies in front of him was increasing and time was running out. He had to find a faster way to solve the problem. However, gaining the trust of the druids was a problem. The forest hermits who had always maintained a neutral stance had always maintained a suspicious attitude towards outsiders. Although they had once been allies with the humans, this relationship had long been destroyed in the First Holy War. This problem made him feel a little troubled, but he could only take one step at a time. After all, the druids were different from the Silver Elves. The Silver Elves had completely sealed off all contact with the outside world, while the druids were not completely isolated from the outside world. It was just that they had very little contact with the druids. The senior elder pondered for a moment. Although he did suspect that these people had ulterior motives, from Joel's description, they had the strength to raise their village to the ground, so there didn't seem to be a need for them to play any tricks. Moreover, they had destroyed an entire group of noble cavalry. The old man couldn't help but feel a little scared when he thought of this. He was different from the other youths in the village. His experience told him that Grodin would not let this matter rest, and he was afraid that his revenge would come soon. When that time came, how could the village resist? That was why he wanted to keep Brando's group here at least for the winter. However, he didn't expect that the moment he opened his mouth, he was rejected by the other party. He couldn't help but think that these people didn't care about their lives and only wanted to make a deal with them. However, the old man thought about it and decided that they didn't have the right to refuse. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but sigh even more deeply, appearing somewhat helpless. "I understand, my lord." The old man bowed and replied helplessly, "I will arrange it for you as soon as possible." "Please rest assured, my lord." Brando listened to the old man's words without batting an eyelid and only nodded. Looking at the senior elder's back as he left, Brando finally felt relieved. He couldn't help but sigh. He understood the elder's worries, but he didn't have the time to stay here for the winter. Moreover, there was no use in staying here. He didn't mind telling Grodin that he was the one who did it, but he couldn't guarantee that the temperamental bastard wouldn't be angry at him. It was almost certain that Grodin would be angry. "Brando, can we help them?" The Roman tugged at his sleeve. "Only if they are willing to enter the forest with us. But even then we can't provide them with enough food for the winter. The only place we can buy food from is Grodin's territory. Little Roman, do you think he will provide us with food?" The young man asked calmly. Romain's eyes flashed. "I'll stay." The red-haired girl sat at the side and rested her halberd on her shoulder. She turned her head and looked at Brando with her amber eyes. Brando touched her forehead. The same spot on her forehead had a black pattern that was spreading like a shadow. Everyone knew that she had nightmares every night and was almost out of breath, but when the girl was awake, she didn't say a word about her situation. "You can't stay, Scarlet." He sighed. "I don't even dare to let you stay too far away from me. You have to stay here for a few months. It's too dangerous for you and these people." The red-haired girl gritted her teeth and snorted lightly as if she didn't care about her condition. But Brando's words moved her. She couldn't stay here. If she became an oracle, these people wouldn't be able to escape death. Amandina looked at everyone without saying a word. Even though she didn't like the Senia people, she couldn't help but clench her fists when she saw this scene. At this time, Brando stood up. He tidied his black coat and let out a sigh of relief. He looked around and said, "I'm going out for a walk." Everyone was stunned. In their impression, this young lord was not someone who liked to wander around. But Brando saw that the Nightsong Tiger and Scarlet were about to follow him and waved his hand. "Nightsong Tiger, Scarlet, stay here. Let me be alone for a while. The two of you should rest and prepare for the upcoming journey." The Nightsong Tiger and Scarlet were startled. Alone? There was a well-known custom among the Senia, and that was their belief that the soul of a person would linger around the living after death, protecting them from the harsh environment of the Black Forest for generations to come. That was why they built long houses for the dead and set up the most important meeting place for the tribe. That was why the souls of the dead were able to experience every moment of life and death with the living. However, at this moment, this sacred longhouse ushered in a dispute. "I don't agree." The young man who spoke earlier shook his head. Sifred was saved with great difficulty, and this means that Goddess Naya doesn't want to see this result. But now we have to send her back? What's the meaning of this? If we don't send her back, we'll all die, a thin middle-aged man said in a gloomy voice. Of course we don't want to, but we have no other choice. Haven't we seen enough deaths? Sifred's mother also left this world for the same reason, but it's all for the sake of others. This is the sacred covenant of Usenia. Brendel gritted his teeth. Sifred's mother left this world for the same reason. Of course, if one day the tribe needs me to complete this mission, I'll say the same thing. He glanced at the young man. What we need now is perseverance and calmness. Don't forget that the tribe did not rely on impulse to survive until today. Bolton, Sifred is your daughter. What do you think? He turned back to the old man. The middle-aged man crossed his arms and did not say a word. Is there no other way? The young man gritted his teeth. How can we give away our own people? Why don't we go into the forest? The elder shook his head. The crops in the fields had not been harvested yet, and if they hid in the forest now, they would only face the fate of freezing or starving to death. Then are we just going to watch Sifred throw her life away? You can't say that. The Baron said that he wants to take Sifred as his adopted daughter. Didn't he say that as long as we send Sifred over, not only will we not have to hide in the forest, we can even become real citizens? Someone in the crowd spoke in a low voice. Everyone fell silent. Take Sifred as his adopted daughter? Everyone knew that the Baron was lying. How could a lord take in Usenia? Even if she was half-elven, there was no way he would do that. Moreover, everyone knew how filthy and despicable those nobles were. Aren't you ashamed to say such words? The young man coldly mocked. That may be the case, but we have no other choice. If the elder thinks it's worth it, we can fight those bastards with our swords and spears. Elder? The middle-aged man coldly snorted. The argument in the longhouse grew louder and louder until it reached the outside of the building. He sat quietly on a rock and looked at the little girl squatting beside him, her green hair flowing like a waterfall. The latter was staring at the ants on the ground with a calm expression, as if she did not hear the argument in the longhouse. Sifred, the young man finally spoke, you can understand my words, right? The little girl was slightly startled. She raised her head and looked at him with her emerald green eyes. I'm sorry, elder brother. She struggled to speak, but this time she spoke in Cruz's language. It's all right, Brando shook his head. I know you were trying to protect yourself at that time. Sifred seems to be a very smart child. The little girl smiled. Her smile was very sweet. She thought for a moment and said, Elder brother? Elder brother. We'll bring into the forest. Also know, the forest? Mother, teach me. Brando felt his heart soften, but he sighed and shook his head. Sifred, even if you bring us into the forest, even if you're not here, the Baron will still find us. Do you understand? The young man spoke in Elvish. Sifred was startled for a moment, and her face quickly turned gloomy. I'm sorry. Brando whispered. The little girl bit her lips. But it was at this moment that the argument in the longhouse became more intense. Author's note. I originally planned to update the character list today and reorganize the levels and equipment. But my mood has been unstable for the past few days and my shoulders and neck are sore. I can't bring myself to do it. I can only apologize to everyone here, especially Sister Crimson. I'll definitely update it tomorrow. I'll go rest now. Thank you. Also, according to the plan, there should be 2 more chapters for Gentle Words of Hope. After that, we'll be moving on to the next part of the story. If you want to know what's going to happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.